Well, we're glad to have her here.
And I assume I can project at some point?
You should be able to, but if you want, you can test it. I think it should be good.
It says I cannot participate.
Oh, you can't. Okay, Carrie, can we fix that? Oh no, I have the ability to fix that. Oh no, it says all panelists. Oh, it's because Carrie was sharing, that's all. That background is a share. So yeah, it works. Great.
That coming through?
Yep, it looks great. Yeah, that's the right format.
Madam Chair, I haven't checked my inbox yet this morning. Is this PowerPoint any chance in our inbox?
I don't know. I haven't seen it. She share it?
That's probably my mistake. I forwarded it to Chantal. I will forward it to Michelle.
Yeah, we can.
Thank you.
That'd be great.
I like my note taking on my presentation.
No, it's good. Good ask.
All right, should be in your inbox, Michelle and Councilor Bach.
Great. And why don't you pull it down for now? Because since we haven't started yet, we should throw the other tile back up. All right. We're going to get going in 1 minute. All right. This is the launch of a busy season, so I'm going to try to set a precedent that we are starting these fairly on time. So Carrie, are you ready?
Ready to go when you are, Madam Chair.
Okay, great. I'm going to gavel it to order. This hearing of the Boston City Council's Ways and Means Committee is now called to order. For the record, my name is Kenzie Bach. I'm the District 8 City Councilor and also the Chair of the Council's Ways and Means Committee. The hearing today is being recorded. It's also being live streamed at boston.gov/city-council-tv and broadcast on Xfinity Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, and FiOS Channel 964. The Council's budget review process ahead will encompass a combination of public hearings and councilor working sessions. And we really hope that we'll get many Boston residents engaging in this process by giving testimony for the record along the way. You can do that in one of several ways. One is to attend a virtual hearing like this and give public testimony. We'll be taking public testimony at the end of each department hearing. We'll also have 4 sessions that are dedicated exclusively to public participation. You can find the full hearing schedule on our website at boston.gov/council-budget. And departmental hearings are going to be taking place most days from now through early June. We've also got 3 hearings that are scheduled that are dedicated to public testimony, and the first of those is this Wednesday at 6 p.m., which will be focused in particular on people's priorities for the recovery, but really how does our budget, how can our budget shape an equitable recovery, and what do you want to see prioritized? Then we'll also have later in the process on May 25th at 6 p.m., a dedicated public testimony hearing about the BPS budget. And on June 3rd at 6 p.m., a dedicated public testimony hearing about kind of anything and everything, whatever you've heard along the way. But as I said, each of our department hearings are also an opportunity for public testimony. To sign up for public testimony, it would be great if you'd use our online form, which you can find on the council's budget review website, and also by emailing the committee at ccc.wm@boston.gov. That's WM for Ways and Means, so ccc.wm@boston.gov. If you email that address, we can get you the link to testify and get you signed up. We do ask that we could do it in the order that people sign up, and when you're called, we ask you to state your name and affiliation or residence and limit your comments to a few minutes to ensure that all comments and concerns can be heard. You can also email written testimony to that committee email at ccc.wm@boston.gov. And you can submit a 2-minute video of your testimony through the form on our website. If you want to find the council's budget website, you go to boston.gov/council-budget. And that explains the whole process, how to testify, upload a video, speak in person, send us your comments and questions. And you can also tweet at us with the hashtag BOSSBudget, BOS budget, throughout this process. So we'll be monitoring that as well. The city of Boston's budget really is a list of its priorities. There's never been a more important moment than as we think about how to bring the city back from this really hard season that we've been in, how to use the federal money that we're getting responsibly, but also every one of your municipal tax dollars. And that's really what this process is focused on. So the budget was introduced back 10 days ago. We'll be having these sort of 6 weeks of dedicated departmental and public testimony hearings. Councilor working sessions will be focused on generating questions in advance of those hearings so we can have the most productive conversation possible. And then in June, we'll take initial action on the mayor's budget and hope to come to a resubmitted budget that best represents the priorities of the people of the city of Boston. So with that, today's hearing is on dockets 0524 to 0526. Orders for the FY22 operating budget, including annual appropriations for departmental operations, for the school department, and for other post-employment benefits. Docket 0527 to 0528, orders for capital fund transfer appropriations. And docket 0529 to 0531, orders for the capital budget, including loan orders and lease purchase agreements. And today, as I said, is the first hearing. So it's really our budget overview hearing about both the budget itself and the sort of revenue projections that it's based on. And we're joined here today by Justin Sterrett, the Chief Financial Officer and Collector Treasurer for the City of Boston, and Nicholas Aranello, our Commissioner for the Assessing Department, Moore Zoran, the Assistant Director for Revenue in the Office of Budget Management, Jim Williamson, the Deputy Director of the Office of Budget Management, and Joanna Bernstein, Assistant Director also for OBM. I'm joined here as well by my colleagues today. In order of arrival, after myself, first my Vice Chair for the Committee on Ways and Means, Councilor Anissa Sabi-George at large, then Councilor Michael Flaherty at large, Councilor Liz Braden, District 9, Councilor Andrea Campbell, District 4, Councilor Julia Mejia at large, Councilor Michelle Wu at large, Councilor Matt O'Malley, District 6, and also our President Pro Tempore, Councilor Ricardo Arroyo, District 5. And I know that in public testimony today, we'll also look forward to hearing from the Boston Municipal Research Bureau. I'm grateful to my council colleagues for joining us. I do want this hearing to be as substantive as possible. And so my preference is going to be for us to, rather than do opening statements, move straight to Chief Sterrett and his team for a presentation, and then go to councilor questions about both the budget and the revenue side for this overview hearing today. Before we do that, I just also want to flag for folks that if you're watching, if you're digging into the budget and you're trying to understand how to better understand it, what the materials available to you are, how to get your questions answered, we are doing a community working session today at 4 p.m. So you can also go to that council-budget, boston.gov/council-budget website, sign up to participate in that. That instead of being a chance to sort of offer public testimony comments, that's a chance for a much more kind of back and forth. How do I find this? Where do I see this? What's going on with this? Kind of a chance for us to help the many community members who I know are paying attention to the budget process and looking to get involved. So that's at 4 p.m. today. We hope you'll join us. And now, without further ado, I'll pass it over to Chief Sterrett and his team.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to share my screen. Is that coming through? Perfect. So thank you, Councilor. Thank you, the entire council, for having us here. As you mentioned, I'm joined by several members of the OBM team, as well as Nick Arnello from Commissioner of Assessing. But this is just a small sampling of the entire ANF team that works on the budget, both within the ANF cabinet, but then within every single city department. It is truly a collaborative, cross-functional city department effort to build an annual budget. We really start this process in December, and it takes us about 5 months to build it. And then obviously we look forward to the robust and engaging conversation that we know we will have with the council and the public over the next 6 weeks, ultimately culminating with a budget for July 1st, which we are excited to dig in. And I know the council will keep us very busy with questions, and we look forward to really making a back and forth process. Just on your public hearing process, if you do find that as you're navigating the city's budget website, there are ways we can improve it, we're always looking to do so. If there's places we can direct folks to make it more clear, or if there's better ways we can display the information, we are always constantly trying to improve our communication materials when it comes to the budget. And thanks to a lot of work by folks on this call, but as well as many folks behind the scenes and our Do It team, we've tried to make the process more accountable and more transparent, and we put every dollar and cent out there through the open data portal. So we encourage folks to take a look at that as well. So without further ado, I will jump into a presentation. I apologize. You will only get to hear from me in the presentation. I'm sure you'll be sick of my voice by the time we are through this, but then everyone from both my team and Nick's team are happy to take questions at the end on any topic, whether it's revenue or spending. And then we look forward to both all the individual department hearings, but a very robust hearing on Thursday around the capital plan, which we will dive more into details with our partners in PFD and others. So I will get started. So before we get into the sort of nitty-gritty details of the budget, we always find it's helpful to set a little bit of a context of where we are financially as a city. Thanks to a lot of good work from folks on this call, especially our partnership with the council over the last 5 to 10 years around the budget. The city entered the pandemic in a very enviable position compared to most, if not all, of our sister cities across the country. We obviously routinely tout our AAA bond rating, which helps keeps our borrowing costs down and keeps confidence high in the local, both the local government, but also the local market when it comes to real estate. We were recognized by Moody's as one of the sort of cities best prepared for a recession, which has certainly borne out over the last year or so as we've entered a sort of time of economic upheaval. That is really based in our strong local economy. Obviously, we continue to attract major businesses and residents to move to Boston, which then translates into a stable revenue base through property taxes. We also have a sort of management-based approach to fiscal responsibility where we take decisive action quickly during the budget year and through the budget process to ensure that we are living within our means and we are not running deficits like other cities, or we are not forced to do significant cuts like other cities have had to do. We're very proud of that work and that partnership with the council on that. And the FY22 budget really builds on that. I think we are fortunate in Boston to have entered and maintained a strong financial base in through the pandemic and coming out as we start to think about recovery. So we are not really starting this budget from where do we replace the services we've had to cut over the previous year. We're really trying to focus on how do we build back stronger, how do we build back more equitably, and how do we build back in a way that's going to make sure that we're investing in areas that are important to the public and important to the council and important to the mayor. So I'm really excited to just talk about this FY22 budget. There's a lot that we're going to go over in the next couple weeks, but certainly in today's hearing, we're going to try to touch on all the major pieces that are moving and look forward to really a thoughtful, engaging process with the council. On the revenue side, we are projecting about $142 million worth of FY22 operating budget growth for next year. This is primarily based in two major buckets, the property tax bucket and the new federal funding bucket, which we will get into in greater detail. State aid is up modestly. Now, we built the budget based on the governor's budget that came out in January, and we will sort of be making adjustments along the way based on what the House and Senate do. And we look forward to seeing those numbers improve, hopefully, as we get through the state budget process. On the local revenue side, this is stuff like both excise taxes and parking fees, but as well as, some of the smaller stuff like 121A agreements and different types of fines and fees that we assess in the city. Those are going to rebound slightly, and we'll get into some more details about that, but we still think that they're going to be well below pre-pandemic levels. And then finally, this new federal funding, which we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about today, both how do we use this money as part of the city budget, but then also how do we set up a transparent and collaborative process to decide how to use this federal funding with outside the city budget through grants and other public facing investments. And we'll certainly dive into that a little bit today. On the spending side, we have a $3.75 billion operating budget. We contains no layoffs or service cuts for next year. It fully funds our liabilities like debt service and OPEB, as well as pensions, which is really the core and a foundational aspect of our budget, is paying down those long-term liabilities, and certainly trying to figure out ways that we can limit that growth going forward is something that we're very mindful of. On the education side, we are super proud of our investment in education, $1.5 billion. About $66 million of all the new money we are getting for next year, or we are projecting for next year, we're setting aside for public education through BPS and charter schools. And then finally, we have a suite of investments of about $40 million designed in Mayor Janey's recovery, reopening, renewal proposals for making the city of Boston more resilient, but also making sure we're investing in an equitable way going forward. And we're excited to talk through some of those investments as we really try to reopen the city in a meaningful way for residents. So starting on the revenue side, as I mentioned, it's a $3.75 billion operating budget. About 73% of that is going to come from property taxes, about 13% from state revenue, about 8% from departmental revenue, 4% from excise taxes, and 2%, relatively small portion, but a relatively large portion of the new money in non-recurring revenue, primarily through the American Rescue Plan, which we'll talk about in a minute. This is pretty consistent with how it's been, the trend lines have been going for the city over the past couple of years. Obviously, we have sort of seen some pretty significant declines in departmental revenue and excise tax revenue, which is going to naturally push up the property tax portion of the annual budget. Now, we hope that that'll even itself out as departmental revenue and excise revenue starts to come back over the next several years, but it's certainly created a one-time blip in a one-time sort of extra blip in property tax revenue as a percentage of the overall budget. It's also why we are sort of constantly looking at improving our collections around non-property tax revenue, whether it's advocating at the state for stuff like the Student Opportunity Act, which we were proud to sort of partner with the council on advocating for, as well as ensuring our departmental revenue and our excise tax revenue are collecting the full amount that is owed to the city, so that we can sort of diversify our revenue stream and we don't become sort of overly reliant on property taxes. Speaking of property taxes are slated to rise really through two fashions this year by about $82 million. The first is growth in the baseline 2.5% Prop 2.5 growth, which is consistent with how the city has treated baseline property tax growth over the last 30 plus years since Prop 2.5 was introduced in the 1980s. And if you have questions, I'm sure Nick from assessing would be happy to jump in and answer of them. The other portion of property tax growth for next year comes from this slide here in new growth. And we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about our new growth projection for next year. So obviously we are projecting $45 million in new growth for next year, which looks like a considerable decline from previous historic highs, which it is. And there's really two reasons for that. One, there was obviously a tremendous economic disruption brought on by COVID-19 when it comes to both development as well as on the commercial side, but as well as development on the residential side. Different buildings were in different stages along the way. So that has an effect on how much new growth we're projecting for FY22, which looks at calendar year 2020, which was basically the year of the pandemic. The other major factor that is going into the new growth projections for next year is around the public health moratorium on construction that happened in April, May, and beginning of June of 2020. That has an effect on when projects got into the ground or how quickly projects were able to complete, which is going to basically push some of that new growth into future fiscal years as there were delays with projects either restarting or getting back to work. Now, we were proud and the city was proud to sort of get that construction work back up and running as fast as possible in as safe as possible a way, but it did have an effect on projects that were sort of in construction or about to go into construction and their delivery timeline, which was pushed out by a fair amount. I will just say that $45 million, while it is below the sort of historic highs that we've seen in the last 5 or 6 years, it is still a considerable amount of new property tax growth into the city. If you look back between the sort of 2000s and 2010 range, you see we never really got above $38 million in new growth. So $45 million, even adjusted for inflation, is still a record high in what would have been normally considered a good year for Boston, outside of the last sort of 5 to 10 years, which have seen sort of really unprecedented growth in the city. Moving on to state aid, obviously, as I mentioned, the state aid budget, or the state aid revenue budget for next year, is up by about $8 million. This is primarily driven by UGA and education aid. Education aid is comprised of both Chapter 70 and charter reimbursement, and certainly areas based on the governor's budget, which were positive for the city as a part of the first year of his implementation of the Student Opportunity Act, but certainly areas that we hope we can continue to advocate for more funding from the state for both BPS and for charter schools. I'll quickly talk about the changing blended revenue. So I mentioned at the beginning, this is sort of the continuation of a trend line we've seen over the past 20 years, where property taxes has grown as a percentage of the city budget, and other parts of the city budget, whether it's state aid or departmental revenue or excise taxes, have either fallen or sort of remained flat. We think that this is sort of hopefully what we'll say the peak of the trend line, and that in future years, as state aid rolls out as a part of the Student Opportunity Act, and then as excise taxes and departmental revenue come back stronger post-pandemic, we think that those numbers will grow, and that hopefully the property tax as a percent of the city budget will fall a little bit. Now, property tax being at this level is certainly a blessing and a curse for the city. On the blessing side, it's really insulated us from some of the major pandemic-related revenue losses that have occurred in other cities that have things like sales taxes or income taxes that have really seen precipitous declines in those revenue collections over the past year. We have been somewhat insulated by that, and that's certainly something that is a good thing. On the flip side, though, if there are longer-term changes in the overall development trajectory and value trajectory of the city, which we don't see currently, we certainly see some softening in the commercial market, but we certainly still see a sort of a relatively hot residential market as it comes as folks continue to both build and transact properties. We're seeing sort of still continued strength there, but it does sort of leave us exposed to potential longer term changes, and that's something that we're mindful of, and why we are constantly trying to increase the types of revenue we receive to try to mitigate some of that long term risk that there might be. On the departmental revenue side, it's about 8%, or about $300 million. We are projecting that this is going to decrease. Now, some of this is some changes to some projections around 121A agreements, which are tax agreements that fall off of the city budget, fall off of the departmental revenue budget, and come onto the property tax revenue. So overall, it's a sort of a net neutral adjustment that we're making, but we are going to continue to see some weakness in some of the areas. One of the areas that in particular that we've seen weakness on in the pandemic, and we think will sort of continue into next year because of the way we're seeing some of the sort of recovery happening, is around parking fines and parking meters. While we think more folks are starting to drive into the city, we actually think that it's still going to be pretty considerably lower than what we were thinking before. So that obviously has an effect on both parking fines that were issued and will be issued going forward, as well as parking meter revenue. Certainly concentrated in many of our business districts in the downtown area. We have not seen the type of return that I think we're hoping to. Now, obviously, we hope that that'll continue as eventually tourism comes back, as well as thinking about next fall and potentially full on-campus schools that will be back in session, as well as businesses who are targeting really the fall to get back in person. So certainly something that we're mindful of going forward, but will have some effects lingering into FY22 and beyond. On the excise tax revenue front, we're projecting about 131 million, or about 4%. This is still down considerably from where we were pre-pandemic levels. Some of the biggest categories, obviously motor vehicles. Motor vehicles is a portion of the annual registration for cars in the city. Room occupancy is obviously the 6.5% short-term rental rate for both hotels and short-term rentals like Airbnb. Meals tax is about a quarter of 0.75% of the annual local meals tax, so for restaurants. And then finally, aircraft is 5% of the average sale price for aircraft fuel sold out of Logan Airport, really an indicator of flights in and out of Logan, which has been obviously another big area that's been impacted. So diving in a little bit, this blue line right here represents the FY20 level of excise tax revenue, which was affected slightly based on the pandemic, but did not reflect a full year. The FY21 levels really do reflect a full year, where we saw sort of really big declines. Now, we accounted for this as part of the tax rate budget, and it's something that we've been monitoring and making adjustments along the way, and certainly something that we think we are at the sort of new pandemic level of normal for excise tax revenue, and we think something that will return sort of as tourism reopens, as vaccinations increase, as some of the public health measures ease going forward. We think that this will certainly grow going forward. That's why we are projecting growth. But even you can see we are still well below some of the pre-pandemic levels. So for something like room occupancy, where we collected about $99 million worth of excise tax revenue in FY20, we're projecting to collect around $37 million for FY21. We're projecting a modest increase into FY22 of about $5 million more, about 41 million, but still relatively small. On the motor vehicle side, that one did not get impacted quite as significantly, mostly because most folks, car sales actually increased, or car sales sort of plateaued in a lot of areas. So it did not take the same hit that other areas of the excise tax budget did. On the meal side, again, pretty big decline in FY21 from about 29 million to about 19 million. And we project a sort of 12% or $2 million increase for that. And then same on jet fuel, a much larger decrease of about 32 million down to $13 million for aircraft fuel. And we do project that will return slightly and slowly. One of the major impacts of both the room occupancy and certainly the aircraft is going to be international travel and travel throughout the country. So while Boston and Massachusetts is one of the leaders when it comes to vaccinations, there are many parts of both the country and the world who are much further behind us when it comes to levels of vaccination and what will ultimately be travel restrictions that will be eased sort of as things go. So that'll be definitely one of the important areas to monitor. So even as we sort of start to reopen safely, it's going to be very dependent on how quickly business and international travel, both for tourism and leisure travel, come back. That'll really affect excise tax revenue. That is also one of the reasons why we did launch the all-inclusive Boston campaign, which is to drive some of that local tourism as we sort of start to reopen safely. We want to get folks both from locally in Boston, but also from the region, visiting different parts of the city to either spend a night in a hotel or get a meal or do different things. So that is an investment in sort of getting the local tourism economy and local hospitality industry back up and running, but it is also an investment to grow city revenue, which supports many of the important areas that we are all interested in investing in. And finally, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about, on the revenue side, the federal funding or the American Rescue Plan funding that we are proposing for next year. So the city every year dedicates about $40 million worth of free cash towards a down payment on our other post-employment benefits payments, which are basically long-term healthcare payments for the city employees. We are one of the only cities in the country who are making proactive payments when it comes to OPEB. That is because we are so far along with our pension payment that we are starting to tackle some of our other long-term liabilities like OPEB. So we are maintaining that $40 million commitment for this year. We're also proposing to use $50 million as part of the FY22 budget of American Rescue Plan funding, which we are still awaiting final award notification from the feds. And we'll ultimately be coming to the council with an appropriation or accept and expend order for the ARP money. And we look forward to having in addition to this conversation, a broader conversation about the ARP funding and our plans to how to use it. But as part of the FY22 budget, we are proposing to use $50 million, and I'll get into that right now. Before I get into that, I thought it would be helpful to kind of set a slate of what is all the federal funding that are out there. There's a lot of conversations about what this federal funding is. There's a lot of conversation about where it's going, how much the city is getting, what it can be used for. And we thought it would be helpful to set a little bit of a sort of a stage for what that looks like. So as obviously many of you know, the American Rescue Plan signed into law about 2 months ago. A month and a half ago by President Biden, included about $1.9 trillion and a whole host of investments in both individuals, those are your $1,400 checks, businesses, which is another round of PPP loans, and then aid to governments, both in fighting COVID-19 as well as starting to plan for recovery and mitigating some of the effects both on individuals but also businesses as COVID-19 begins to recede and we start thinking about a recovery. The pot of money that I'm going to be spending most of today talking about is that bolded pot of about $350 billion for state and local governments. So the city, and this is, there's a couple different numbers floating out there, so I thought I would clarify. The city, as the sort of a city eligible with a population of over 500,000, is eligible to apply for $435 million directly from the federal government as a major city that we are expected to receive as part of this larger $350 billion package. We are also eligible to apply through the state for the Suffolk County portion of this $350 billion, which we estimate is somewhere in the $100 to $120 million range. And again, we are still waiting on final guidance on what that looks like. So our conversation today is really focused on that initial $435 million and is actually only focused on the first tranche of that $435 million, about $215 million that we're expected to get in the first year, but I'll get into that in a second. I do also want to point out two other buckets of money that could be of interest to folks. In addition to the local government money that is included in that $350 billion, there's several $billion going to the state that they are also going through their own process for how to figure out how to spend it. And we would certainly welcome and partner and want to partner with the council on advocating to make sure, despite the fact that Boston and every other city in the Commonwealth got their own money on this, we want to be making sure we're advocating to the state to make sure we don't get left behind as the state considers how to use their funding. In addition to that, there's about $129 billion in K through 12 education aid, which is really the fourth round of education funding that has come out of the federal government, whether it was CARES or some of the initial coronavirus relief funding, which is in excess of another $200 million coming out of this funding that will go directly to BPS, and certainly welcome a robust conversation about that funding as well. All told, we think somewhere in excess of $700 million will come to the city of Boston, either through K through 12, local government aid, or other housing supports that have come up and already gone through the council. So definitely a lot of funding, definitely a lot of rules around that funding, and definitely a lot of good fiscal practices that need to be put into place around that funding. And we look forward to having all of that conversation with the council over the next couple of weeks and months and years, frankly, as I know the council recently standing up the COVID-19 recovery committee. I'm sure that will be obviously will be a major topic for that committee as well. I did want to talk a little bit about some of the rules around the $435 million, which is really the focus of today's and the FY22's federal government funding. So as I mentioned, it's about $435 million. It's going to come in two tranches, one coming in May of 2021, and the second half coming about a year from now in May of 2022. We are also waiting final guidance that'll come along with this first tranche of money, which will really lay out the exact specifics on what we can use this funding for. But the legislation as written laid out really three big buckets of things that you can spend this money on. One, and what we'll talk about today, is the revenue replacement for the provision of government services. Is basically just a fancy way of saying revenue replacement for government, for work that government does. So that's basically all the work that our departments do, whether it's through investing in small businesses or investing in public health or investing in our city. We have a whole structure of investments that we're using this federal funding for in the FY22 budget, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The second bucket is assistance to small businesses, households, and other hard-hit industries around economic recovery. So there will be a lot of conversation, a lot of work around how do we restart our small businesses, how do we restart our support our households and support other hard-hit industries coming out of COVID-19 that have been affected by the pandemic. And then finally, a slightly different bucket, but definitely something that's top of mind, investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. You can certainly see the need coming out of COVID-19 for continued investments in broadband infrastructure, and we look forward to having a robust conversation. I think there's certainly look forward to partnering with not a city governmental agency, but a quasi-city public agency and the Boston Water and Sewer Commission to talk about what type of needs they may have coming out of COVID-19. And you'll see we've already started this sort of work around broadband infrastructure with $1 million investment in the city budget next year around digital equity, but certainly more work to do around that as we think about what a longer term comprehensive recovery might look like when it comes to broadband. So the plan for the initial tranche of Boston funding is really based in two things. How do we get funding out equitably? How do we get it out efficiently? And how do we get it out in a way that avoids some of the challenges and some of the drawbacks that federal funding might come with? So as I mentioned, the federal funding can really be spent over 5 fiscal years between FY21 and FY25. So we really do think about this money as a long-term solution and a long-term part of the city budget. That's why we're not sort of focusing on some of the other portions of the money. We're really just focusing on this first 215 million because that's what we're going to get in the door, but it also sets ourselves up to avoid some of the ERA cliffs. And if folks were around for that, we created a whole bunch of new programs, or we invested in a whole bunch of new things with ERA funding. And this is both true at the city, but also at the state and also across the country. And then that money went away, and all of a sudden there was sort of budget crunches in different parts of city and local governments that we're trying to avoid with this funding. So of this first 215 million, we're proposing to use $100 million for that government services revenue replacement. We're going to talk about how we're going to spend $50 million of it in the reopening, recovery, and renewal categories as part of the FY22 budget. We're also looking to spend about $50 million of it to replenish our own reserves. One of the most important characteristics and guidance that we've gotten so far from the GFOA, the Government Finance Association of America, is our Government Finance Officers Association, is that the cities and towns and localities should really be using this to looking at this funding to replenish local reserves, and we're proposing to use about $50 million for that purpose. And then we're proposing about $115 million we're going to set aside and look forward to filing a council order to this effect in the coming weeks around what we'll call more public facing and more sort of community-based programs that is funding directly for businesses and individuals and households and different programmatic things outside of the work of government for sort of this new committee that the Mayor Janey is proposing around the Equitable Recovery Resources Coordinating Committee, which I know is a mouthful, but it's basically the sort of a first of its kind in Boston type cross-functional committee of different city departments as well as public stakeholders around sort of how do we make sure that these resources are coordinated, how do we make sure these resources are delivered in an equitable fashion, and how do we make sure we're soliciting public feedback for it. There will be a robust public process as part of this committee, and we look forward to both the public input on that as well as the council input as we think about how to best use that $115 million for sort of targeted investments in the economic recovery. And the last thing I'll just quickly mention, one of the things that we're really focused on, as I mentioned, is sort of avoiding the fiscal cliffs that come with any type of one-time federal resource. So this slide just basically shows, in the FY22 budget, we're using, about $50 million to replace what is ostensibly excise tax revenue that has sort of fallen off pretty precipitously when it comes to the pandemic-related effects. And we're proposing to use about $50 million, and that $50 million of ARP money will slowly be ramped down over time as excise tax revenue returns and replaces it. So it avoids those types of cliffs, and it avoids those types of potential ERA type issues that arose in previous federal funding packages. So that is everything on the revenue side. I'm going to move and talk about the spending side now. Obviously, we can go back and dive into any of the revenue stuff once we get to the Q&A portion, but I want to give folks the full overview of what's in the budget before we move on from that. So on the overall FY22 budget, as I mentioned, it's a $142 million increase, about 3.9%. That includes about $29 million in increases for city departments, about a $4.2 million increase for the Public Health Commission, mostly new spending in the Public Health Commission. So that's something we'll talk about in a little bit, but that's new investments that we were able to put in to both support their ongoing COVID work, but also a lot of work that both came out of COVID and came out of a lot of their work around racism as a public health emergency, as well as the Health Equities Task Force, new investments there. As I mentioned, on the public education side, we have about a $66 million increase. And then finally on fixed costs, this is pension and debt service. Again, this is a very large increase of our total pie. So We really try to be mindful when we think about our fixed cost growth, and we really want to be mindful of limiting that, because every dollar we spend on a fixed cost is a dollar we can't spend somewhere else. So just very quickly, high level, in the overall pie of the FY22 budget, we're spending about 41%, as I mentioned, about 1.5 billion on public education, about 18% on public safety, which is fire, police, and emergency management, about 10% on other city departments, about 7%, 263 million on transportation, including our contribution to the MBTA, and then smaller portions on health insurance and fixed costs, both of which support all of the other areas of city government through employee benefits. As I mentioned, we have about $142 million of new funding that we're playing with. We're spending about 47% of that new money on public education, about 44 million of it on fixed costs, about 23 million, as I mentioned, on departmental growth, and about $9 million in an increase to the collective bargaining reserve. One of the things that is obviously an unknown factor at this point, but something we're obviously working on, is collective bargaining agreements for FY22 are unilaterally across the board in all parts of city government up for next year. We are in negotiations with unions who are open for negotiations. There are several unions who are open now, several more that are opening up as we get towards FY22, and that's sort of a little bit of an unknown as we think about 22 and beyond. As I mentioned, fixed costs, a big increase for next year, about $44 million, represents a big portion of our new funding, but it does keep us on track to fully fund our pensions by 2027, the existing schedule, as well as funding to support the $200 million increase and $3.2 billion total FY22 through 26 capital plan, which invests in a whole host of important things, which we're going to talk about more on Thursday, but that is the key. This investment in debt service is key to making that investment on the capital plan side. So excited that we're able to support that for next year. On the city departments, so this is just city departments, we break down city spending in a couple different ways. Between personnel and health benefits, we're spending over 70%, about 73% on employee personnel, about 30% on contracts, about 8.4% on special appropriations, and other sort of supplies and standalone investments. I wanted to talk about a couple of new budget methodologies and new processes we went through in the FY22 budget process. So obviously, coming out of last year's creation of the Equity and Inclusion Cabinet, we introduced an equity framework into the departmental budget process that really tried to formalize and put equity at the front end of all of our budget decisions, and really working in close partnership with the equity cabinet as well as departments to understand their investments and understand making sure they're asking questions about how they've engaged the community, how these investments are going to affect the community, and what are the long-term effects that they're hoping to achieve with those types of investments. In addition to that, obviously, equitable procurement remains a centerpiece of this budget. This was the first year of the inclusion of the equitable procurement plans with every single city department's budget. So that's something that we were excited to work with departments on, as well as Kevin Coyne in our purchasing department, to figure out what were the major procurements coming up and how can we focus on targeting improving the equitable procurement practice of the city. So really excited that we were able to do that. And then going forward, it's really going to be a year-round conversation with obviously the equity cabinet, the economic development cabinet, around sort of how do we continue to improve our equitable procurement numbers and implement the orders that were the last two orders that were signed around improving equitable procurement. And then finally, on the engagement front, I think there is a tremendous amount of focus and a tremendous amount of interest in the budget, and we sort of want to look to partner with both the council and your process, as well as starting our own processes and doing our own work, because I think you can never have enough engagement through a pilot program with Monum around moving through the budget, a dance program that we've worked with it's an 8-week virtual residency with folks starting in East Boston and potentially, hopefully expanding to citywide around the FY22 budget and sort of understanding it through different mediums, as well as, a longer term conversation around the budget. We really do, while we think about the budget as a one-time event, we really do want to take this conversation to the community as a year-round event and look to certainly partner with the council as you work on that. Moving to some of our major investment areas for FY22. So as I mentioned, we are committing, and the FY22 budget commits to the second year of the $100 million all new funding commitment to BPS. So this is all new stuff that we were able to afford within this FY22 budget for BPS and keeps us on track for that FY23, $100 million all-in commitment. One of the things we've heard sort of loud and clear from BPS is how helpful that this commitment has been in terms of not only the dollars, but the consistency and the sort of planning that it's allowed them to do, where many other districts, school districts across Massachusetts and across the country are all trying to figure out how to use their federal money to do to make up losses that they've sustained either through cuts at the local level or cuts at the state level. We have not only insulated BPS from all of those cuts, we've been able to make strategic investments to start the work of recovery. So this is, a lot of efforts around family liaisons, social and emotional learning. And I'm sure as the council dives into the FY22 budget with BPS, they'll be happy to walk through all the specific new investments that are afforded within this increase. So we were really happy to do that. On police accountability and safety, justice, and healing, we have a sort of a package of proposals and investments. So we obviously have the $1 million to stand up through the new executive director, Stephanie Everett, around the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency, which includes funding for 10 staffers as well as technology supports. Really look forward to partnering with Director Everett on building out her needs for that budget. Obviously, when she gets, she'll obviously hit the ground running with the reviews, but also trying to build out her staffing and what makes the most sense going forward. We have a $1.75 million investment in the Health and Human Services Cabinet around alternative policing. So Chief Martinez and obviously Superintendent Long and the police department working together to develop a pilot of this program in the next couple months. So this is funding to really start to do the hard work of taking the ideas that are out there around alternative policing and responding to mental health cases and different types of cases or calls in the city with a different type of response network is a really difficult task, but it also requires an investment. So that's why we're putting this investment in here. And then finally, within the police department budget, obviously, this has been a topic of conversation over the last couple of months with the council, and we appreciate the many hearings, certainly spearheaded by you, Councilor Bach, around police overtime, around monitoring the numbers for the year. So I think it's obvious, and the police department is going to spend about $65 million worth of overtime in FY21, which is obviously considerably over the FY21 budget. So we are proposing a $21 million cut to the FY21 spending level of $65 million to about $43.9 million, represents about 675 hours of overtime for next year. And obviously, we've made some progress on getting down the overall spending number in FY21, certainly not enough progress. So we're trying to make some investments to go along with this cut to help achieve that reduction. That includes growing the size of the sworn force by 30 officers and 2 full police classes for next year, starting in June, this upcoming July and December, to get more officers on the street, as well as increasing the cadet class from 40 to 60, as well as an investment in the medical triage unit, which includes doctors and clinicians, which is super important to getting officers who are on medical leave, either the help and medical attention they need, or getting them back to work so that they can help work on the overall overtime number. So good investments on the overtime side, as well as trying to get that number down. As well as about $1 million investment in racial equity training. One of the major recommendations of the task force from last year, the police task force from last year, was around training. So there's $1 million investment in that as well. So my last couple slides are really going to focus on how we're spending that our new investments for next year, and they're really focused in Mayor Janey's ideas around recovery, reopening, and renewal. So the first one is about a $14 million investment to how do we help support both really hard hit industries, but also individuals come out of COVID stronger. There's obviously been disproportionate effects of COVID-19 on different businesses and different populations and different types of residents. So we're really trying to focus on how do we sort of recover from COVID-19. That includes a $5 million investment in youth jobs, Age Strong, substance and mental health support, certainly coming out of the public health equity, racial equity task force out of COVID-19, as well as supporting 5,000 summer jobs and 1,000 school year jobs for next year. Includes $4 million in different job training and economic development supports around the arts, tourism, local businesses, green jobs, as well as mobility jobs through the Department of Transportation, which we're excited to work on, as well as $2 million to support, obviously, as I mentioned, digital equity, childcare entrepreneurs, and then subsidizing public transit, additional subsidization of public transit options, which we're excited to partner with the MBTA on. On the reopen side, we have about $9 million worth of investments in reopening our city. These are investments really geared toward how do we reopen city services in a safe and enjoyable way for residents, obviously many of which have either been operating in limited capacity or been unable to operate. So we're really focused on how do we sort of get people excited to get back to their city services that they love, as well as doing it in a safe way as we start to think about a recovery and reopening when it's safe to do so. So that is $2 million to expand programming in a whole bunch of different departments, but that's arts, including dedicated funding through the Strand Theater for programming there, expanded programming in the Parks Department, BCYF, including waiving membership fees going forward as part of BCYF to not only break down barriers to entry, but also making sure that we're getting folks back to BCYF centers in a meaningful way. Investments in Age Strong supports and additional programming, and then new funding for the Disabilities Commission, the Veterans Commission, and the Human Rights Commission, all of which faced different challenges when it comes to COVID-19 and certainly have different needs when it comes to coming out of COVID-19. We have about $1.5 million to reopen civic spaces safely. So this both includes city buildings and making sure that we're doing so in a way that's safe and but for both residents and visitors, but also our staffs to make sure that they're fully secure when it comes to reopening buildings, as well as $1 million of that funding for a safe and effective and robust voting apparatus for FY22. So there obviously will be an election upcoming, and this will ensure that we have the same levels of expanded mail-in voting and early voting that we had for last year's very successful election in terms of turnout. So we're excited to support that. And then additional $1 million to continue some of the technology and service city service delivery that we're able to provide as part of the existing COVID-19 response. We obviously had to transition many of our efforts to either online or digital or through different web portals. So we're and some of those things are good things and we want to keep going forward. So that required about $1 million investment to maintain some of those services into FY22. And then finally, we have about $16 million to how do we renew and really come out of COVID-19 to think about city government differently, think about our investments in local neighborhoods and businesses differently. So that includes about $5 million for new housing and homelessness supports, as well as expanding housing opportunities in all different types of income levels across all neighborhoods, including individual support for commercial tenants as part of housing projects, which we're excited about. As I mentioned, we have about $5 million to not only fund the new equity inclusion cabinet, but also obviously support OPAT and different alternative policing practices, including the new pilot. And then $2 million investments across a host of different departments as we think about post-COVID-19 recovery and renewing and coming back better, investments in climate and equity and technology. So I will mention more about this on Thursday at the hearing, but the FY22 budget website is now live, where you can go in and see the capital maps feature, where you can go in and see all the new capital projects and existing capital projects for FY22 through 26, as well as obviously take a look by neighborhood. And then would certainly encourage everyone to go to the FY22 budget website, which includes a whole host of written materials, as well as the PDFs of the budget book itself, as well as a link to the open data portal where you can download and sort of dig into the details of both the operating budget, the capital plan, and the revenue budget. So with that, I will stop talking and turn it over to the council. And I just want to again thank the entire OBM staff who works tirelessly all the time, but in a COVID environment with, obviously doing remote, coming in the office partly, unable to gather and really bring together some of the natural friction and fun and energy that comes from building a budget when you're all in the same room. We're able to produce a really thoughtful and meaningful budget in a time when I think I certainly agree, Councillor, the stewardship of public resources, especially coming out of COVID-19, is especially important this year. Not that it's not important every year, but is very vital. And I really want to thank the Budget Office, the entire A&F Cabinet, the Mayor's Office, and all the city departments and their A&F folks and department heads and cabinet chiefs for a really collaborative process, and look forward to both your questions today, counselors, the follow-up questions when it comes to the written materials, as well as the 30 or so hearings over the next month or two, and having a really good dialogue. And with that, I will stop sharing and turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Chief Sterrett. Thanks for the thorough presentation, both for us and for members of the public, which I think is important at the start of, as you say, what's going to be a long process. I think I'm going to mainly defer my questions to the end in the interest of colleagues. I just, one question and one comment. I think it's worth, I just think it's worth flagging for colleagues. I've had some conversation with the chief about this already, but I think that the idea that we want the federal money, thinking about how we're going to spend that, to go through a process that's in partnership with our departments, that is focused on equity, that has space for kind of like the grassroots gut check of like, where do we really see the needs in this moment on the economic health perspective, is all absolutely right. I think we can pursue all of those things without moving into a framework that removes the council's sort of democratic accountability piece over that money. And so, looking forward to working with the administration in a way that kind of brings those things to the fore, but also vets them through a council process, rather than sort of having that process be post-council. So I think we'll have more conversation on that in May, but definitely appreciate the budget office's partnership on that. And then I guess I wanted to ask, and it would be fine, Justin, if this just turns into a follow-up, but you referenced kind of adding an equity lens to the budget this year. What are the actual tools of analysis or sort of frameworks that were used to do that?
Sure. So it's obviously an evolving process, and one that, I think we've always, we've done a very diffused level of equity review, where a department will say, and I think the streets department does a particularly good job of this, where they go neighborhood by neighborhood, sidewalk by sidewalk, to really put an equity lens on all of their investments. And that always kind of happened at the departmental level. What we did this year was, as departments were either seeking new investments or seeking new proposals, they're required to submit forms that sort of talk obviously about the narrative portion of what the investment is, but we also asked them to submit a list of questions and answers to questions around sort of what type of community process they went through, what types of populations will these investments serve, what are the effects on those types of populations, both sort of with this investment, and it could be reductions, it could be investments, it could be new reform proposals, the way a service is delivered, and then ask them to sort of submit that information to the budget office, where we then sort of partnered with then Carolyn Crockett, or Chief Crockett at the time, and now going forward with Chief Barrios Milner, around sort of understanding those impacts and understanding how to best interpret them as when it comes to the decision-making process. So obviously sort of an exciting new thing that we were able to do this year, and one that I know will take on more forms as we go forward and dive deeper into data. There's a lot of different types of sort of data ways we can look at equity and look at sort of investment. So really looking forward to building that process out going forward, but excited that we were able to take that first step this year.
Got it. Yeah, I think that's something we'll be following up further with departments on. And just a quick informational thing. I know that in some places the 1.75 pilot related to alternative response, which of course is something that counselors have proposed and are interested in. There was a 90-day number attached to that at some point, and I wasn't sure, and you mentioned it again a few months today, and I was wondering, is that 90 days from July 1, or is that 90 days from the April announcement in terms of design, or what was the thought there?
I think it's 90 days from the announcement, which would put us sort of into the July, August timeframe, I think. But basically the 90 days is more related to Chief Martinez and the police department working together to come up with a proposal. I think we're obviously they're going to have a community process and understand the impacts of it. And then hopefully as we near July 1, both that process as well as the budget process are syncing up so we can launch it later this year.
Okay, great. All right, I think I'll defer further questions from me, go to colleagues. I want to note that we were joined, actually, just after I had done the list, we were joined by Councilor Frank Baker from District 3 and also by Councilor Ed Flynn from District 2. So grateful to all my council colleagues for being on today. The order of questions that we'll be doing is after myself, my Vice Chair, Councilor Asavi George, Councilor Michael Flaherty, Liz Braden, Andrea Campbell, Julia Mejia, Michelle Wu, Matt O'Malley, Ricardo Arroyo, Frank Baker, Ed Flynn, and then we'll come back to the top. Again, I would just encourage colleagues. Obviously, we're going to be in the weeds with each of the departments. So if you have a super in the weeds with the department question, maybe save that for one of the other 35 hearings. But of course, like Chief Jarrett and his team have been over all of this on both the budget and revenue side. So, any questions, fair game. I will be running a timer, and as with the past, I'll hold up my gavel when you're getting close to the end, and then you'll hear the timer go off. So thanks so much. With that, Councilor Sabi-George.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for leading us through this process and setting such strict guidelines and rules. I think that we're off to the right start today, and I thank the administration for their continued work on our city's recovery and ensuring continued stability, especially continued financial stability. As an at-large city council representing the entire city of Boston, I use this budget season to assess and make improvements on how the city is responding to the needs and issues of all of its residents. As chair of the Education Committee and vice chair of this committee, Ways and Means, as well as Public Health, it's incredibly important. It's an incredibly important responsibility to ensure that our city is financially responsible and thoughtful with our spending. As an elected official, a mother, a former teacher, and a small business owner, I've reflected on my priorities and the priorities of our work as an office. I'll highlight some of the things I'll be advocating for throughout this process, looking at the FY22 budget, and also note that I've submitted a letter detailing some of this, or in greater detail, to the administration with a list of those priorities. But a few of them that I'll be looking forward to seeing through. We've seen some of it highlighted in today's hearing, and certainly as we get into the weeds, as Madam Chair Bach has mentioned, we'll go through it in greater detail. But I'm looking forward to seeing federal money being used to support some significant public health efforts, especially around the work at Mass and Cass and those dealing with homelessness, substance use disorder, and mental illness. I also want to make sure that we are very directly supporting our small businesses through some grant work. I'd also like to see an increase in funding for the Mobile Sharps team as we continue to see increased impacts of improperly discarded sharps in our neighborhoods and across our city. I'd also like to see an increase in funding for our community health centers through the Health Commission to continue towards a COVID-19 recovery and respond to the increase of infectious diseases, specifically HIV and AIDS. We'd also love to see, and this has come up over this last year through some of our work around the opioid crisis and homelessness and mental health illnesses that many of our unsheltered residents are facing, but I'd like to see an additional investment to increase the capacity for Boston EMS's Squad 80 team, as well as some of the other outreach efforts that are happening across our city's agencies, as well as the BEST team, which was, I'm grateful to see that investment of $2 million will continue through this year as we've slowly been increasing the size of and the number of co-responders working with Boston Police, both as co-responders and more proactive efforts. We know that we need an increase in trauma supports that are directly accessible to our residents, and we'll talk more about that, I'm certain, through the Health Commission's work, as well as some of our BCYF efforts and our Boston Police Department. And then last but certainly not least, and certainly this isn't a full list, but I would like to see additional investments towards supportive housing, affordable housing, and family-sized housing through our work as a city, and that will certainly come up in the Department of Neighborhood Development's hearing. But for today, my questions are very specific around some of the federal funding that's coming in, and grateful for the federal funding that we've received through a great deal of advocacy over this last year through the Walsh administration and now through the current administration. So I'm curious how the city has approached each type of these fundings and how have we decided to spend it? And then can we also get a brief update on how any leftover federal money from this last year is being used? And that will be it for my questions, at least in this round. Something may come up in, later through this hearing. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sure. Thanks, Councilor, for those great questions. I'll take the first one first. So each of the different pots of money that we've been able to access as a city has typically come with different requirements. Some of them are reimbursement based, some of them are grants, some of them are, grants to the school district. So there's a different category that comes with each of them. So there's probably a slightly different process for each of them. I think the two big buckets I'll talk about for the city money are really the coronavirus relief fund, which was the $121 million that the city got at the height of the pandemic, or sort of the onset of the pandemic back in March of 2020, which we did an accept and expend through the council with, laid out some priorities, and then really used to fund the public health crisis over the past 12 months. I believe it was probably a month and a half, 2 months ago that we had the council hearing on that funding. So that funding is fully spent, or will be fully spent by the end of the month, basically, around that first tranche of money that we received. And that funding went towards about $23 million directly to the Boston Public Health Commission, about $23 million to the schools, about $20 million to the rental relief fund, as well as in excess of $20 million to economic development, small business support. So that's stuff like the Winter Relief Fund, the Reopen Boston Fund, all those different funds that we had to stand up over the last couple months, as well as stuff like Boston Hope and the medical response that we've had. So there's been that was a very much sort of in the weeds type, we got to stand up a field hospital, we got to do X, Y, or Z, and working closely, and glad that we were able to spend that money in an effective way. For the second tranche of money, the American Recovery Act money, we're really trying to be thoughtful about it. We're really trying to do two things. We're trying to make sure we're using it in an efficient way. So that's why we're standing up this committee to sort of do a lot of this cross-functional collaboration between schools and us and public health, and identifying many of the needs that you raised, I think, as top priorities for investment, and look forward to filing that order with the council once we receive word from the feds. I know there's been a lot of speculation about how much we're getting and what we can use it for. We still have not heard directly from the feds on when this money will come. We think it'll come in May, and we are waiting final guidance. So that'll really dictate, I think, the final approach. But we did want to make sure that we were reflecting it in this year's budget. That's why we have sort of some meaningful investments in the 22 budget using this money, as well as setting up a public process around how to make decisions on it going forward. And we look forward to partnering with the council on that as we think about the next year. There is a whole bunch of other pots of money around schools and rental relief that I know either will have conversations or have had conversations. I know the council has had several hearings around the D&D funding for the rental relief fund. Excuse me. And, I think that there will be separate processes set up both either through the school committee process or this process, depending on the sort of owner of the fund at the end of the day.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Appreciate the time, and Chief Starrett, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Councillor Asabi George. And I'll just say that, 1 second, my timer's about to go off. I'll just say that certainly, although there is not an appropriation order that comes through council for the school money, that we've been clear with BPS, and will be clear throughout the process in the weeks ahead, that we do expect to be having a conversation about how BPS is using that money. And I think in addition to the 200 odd million, right, Chief Starrett, that you mentioned, there's also ESSER funds going back to the December bill that I think have not been allocated by the school department yet. Is that accurate?
They have outlined some plans for some of the money, but I do think there's ample conversation to have around the rest of it.
Yeah. So I just want to assure everyone that we will be doing that as part of this process as well. Next up is Councillor Flaherty, and then it'll be Councillor Braden. Councillor Flaherty.
Thank you, Madam Chair, obviously, and good morning to Justin and his team. And Justin, at the onset, there's no way to sugarcoat the property tax increase to the residents across the city who are struggling, obviously, themselves throughout the pandemic, and then to get hit with that. For some, it's been devastating. So I know that I saw your slideshow presentation. I'm like, so there's no way to sugarcoat the increased property tax across the board. Folks are outraged and obviously bewildered as to why they would receive such a hefty increase when we're in the middle of a pandemic, et cetera. So that part continues to and will continue to dog us throughout the budget process and beyond. Also, on a similar note, obviously, as the new chair of the new committee on Boston's COVID-19 recovery. Look forward to working with you and your team and my colleagues to get answers to the questions that some have just mentioned this morning, sort of the who, what, where, when around the federal funds, et cetera. So in addition to obviously being in touch on this budget throughout the budget process, we'll be obviously working closely as those funds become available and there's discussion about disbursement, et cetera. So, and again, we'll be taking cues from my colleagues as it pertains to their respective districts or my at-large colleagues citywide. And just want to sort of do a quick rapid fire. I think my main concern obviously around making sure chiropractic services are added to the formula. That should not be a bargain for issue. We should use the strength of our numbers, if you will, with the insurance companies and demand that be part of it to reduce healthcare and copay costs, to reduce doctor visits, and also to get folks back to work sooner, and make sure that there's not a path of opioid and or significant time off from work when with a simple adjustment they could be back to work in a relatively short period of time. We have a fiscal responsibility to the taxpayers. We also know sort of the lost man and lost women hours that goes into on-job injuries. And it should be something that we as a city are dictating with respect to the insurance companies, not throwing it out to the individual bargaining units, asking them what they think, because at the end of the day, they're always going to take increased wages and or they'll have a laundry list of other things that may take precedence, but we have a responsibility to reduce those costs and to get folks back to work as quickly and as safely as possible. And that will do just that. So look forward to a response on that. And then some rapid fire capital funding, obviously support for Vision Zero initiatives across the city. We've heard concerns about the Octopus intersection. That's the 5-way intersection, particularly over in Rosendale, Cummins Highway, Canterbury Highway, ALH, so American Legion Highway, capital funding for climate ready initiatives. And then from the operating budget, funding for our public safety departments. I got to get a better sense around the department's hiring efforts to keep up with attrition. Got to get your sense around the strategy to reduce the overtime budget. And obviously, how can we shift our spending? So folks that, particularly in the community that like to see, the bicycle units, particularly during the warmer weather, and make sure that they continue to see those, as well as increase funding for the best clinicians and other BPHC initiatives around the Mass and Cass area. Funding for public works, an operating budget that would support a more comprehensive approach to sidewalk repair. We have a lot of sidewalks that are being uprooted by those big trees and or in disrepair. So having sort of a clearly defined and predictable road to having these repaired would be great. Funding for inspectional services, particularly all of the ZBA reforms that have just been implemented, as well as funding for more inspectors and additional resources for the short-term rental issues that we continue to still deal with as a city, and also funding for to support the needle cleanup routine maintenance in and around sort of the high traffic areas, particularly in our parks and playgrounds and ball fields where people still continue to see discarded and used needles, syringes, et cetera. So we also need to talk about the digital infrastructure. How can we support the transition of city services online? And is there, funding budgeted for this in this fiscal year? The Tech Goes Home program. We saw firsthand the digital infrastructure and digital divide that we experienced as we were ramping up ourselves with Zoom and trying to engage the public across the city. So BPS funding, obviously looking to funding that will go towards a more transparent, sustainable partnerships that can reduce learning loss and support students that were disproportionately impacted by COVID. Getting folks back up to their grade level would be, I think, an important priority. We're in a global economy. We're competing with folks not only in surrounding communities in our own state, but around the world. And that loss, year of academic loss is going to be, we're going to sort of pay for that years down the road if we don't jump on this and get get folks back into the classroom, and more importantly, get them caught up. Obviously, the FinCom, we talked a lot about that last year, and the need to increase funding for FinCom so they can expand their overview. An Office of Food Access increasing operating budget to support additional staff to give us the ability to deal with the food insecurity issue. So that's sort of a laundry list off the top of my head as we're sort of stepping off with today's budget. Again, look forward to working with you, Justin, and your team on budget issues as well as our COVID-19 recovery, and appreciate whatever you can address in the short time that we have.
Sure. Thank you, Councilor. A lot of shared priorities, I think, both in the budget and look forward to talking about them. I'll just highlight two quick things. One, in my new capacity as CFO, happy to partner with you on the chiropractor issue to talk about what that might look like. And then the point you raised around needles, both you and Councilor Sabi-George mentioned, there is a $500,000 investment within the Public Health Commission of new funding, of which about $375,000 is for the Community Syringe Program, which is a new program of actually investing in or paying for folks to turn in needles that they may find or they may have, or they may be sort of in contact with. So we think that both not only is a public health investment, but as well as certainly will help with some of the issues around discarded needles that I know is top of mind for many folks. So definitely some good investments there to help to start to address that, as well as what we imagine will be additional investments through the federal funding around public health and certainly mass CAS, that whole area. So definitely look forward to partnering with you on all the issues you outlined and going from there.
Great. Thank you so much, Chief Jarrett and Councilor Flaherty. Next up is Councilor Braden, and then it'll be Councilor Campbell. Councilor Braden.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to Justin and all of your team for producing such an incredibly comprehensive and well presented budget outline this morning. A few questions. I was wondering about pilot payments. I know it's a voluntary program by our nonprofits. Have we seen are we expecting to see a drop in pilot payments, or how much will we expect to see from pilot? I had a question about youth services and youth workers, and we have two large housing complexes in Alston Brighton, and we're really struggling as our youth are getting into trouble because we do not have programming for them. And I was wondering about just actually targeting youth programming and funds to help support those youth. They've had a really traumatic time during COVID, and we really want to hold them up and advocate for good services to help them get back on track after this time. The big £800 gorilla in our neighborhood is the Jackson Man Community Center and School Complex. I was down there last week for a vaccination clinic and realized, this is an essential piece of our infrastructure. It's the only community center in our district. It is the polling station for 5 precincts. And when there's an election, people are queued down the road. I'm really concerned that we're not actually, and I'm going to get into the weeds with this when we get further down, but because it's sort of an intersectionality between BPS and BCYF and facilities, it's a complex situation. And I really hope that we can have a very robust conversation and a plan, because if we don't want to leave it to July 22 when the doors close to say, okay, now we'll start planning. We need to start planning now so that we have alternative accommodations identified and adequate resources earmarked to make sure that we have a smooth transition and that we don't drop the ball on this. The community center is a emergency heating and cooling center. It is a polling station. It provides daycare, childcare, lots of different services. And I really feel very concerned that we're not addressing that with any sense of urgency. I had a question. I want to echo Councillor Flaherty's concerns about the reliance on revenue from our real estate taxes. Many of our folks have really felt the impact of the big increase this year, and really that sort of brings us back into the pilot payments and other sources of revenue that we can tap into to decrease the burden on our homeowners. And I think that's really about it. I'm going to get into the weeds a lot more when we get into the departments, but those are some big concerns from my district. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Councillor, for the questions. All good topics for discussion in the future, but I'll try to touch on each of them very quickly. So within the capital plan, we do have some additional funding for the Jackson Man, both community center and the long-term plan for the building itself. So definitely look forward to, that's just the money side of the equation. We certainly need to have a robust community-based conversation about the future. So but I would defer to BPS in that conversation over the next couple of days. As far as youth-focused investments, I think we're really proud of a lot of our youth-focused investments in this budget. We have a tremendous amount of new funding to expand programming when safe, and I get that that's always a trigger for all of this stuff right now, is when it's safe, around expanded BCYF centers, expanded parks programming, expanded arts programming, expanded public space programming to do exactly that, to sort of occupy youth's time and definitely give them safe places to go and gather, as well as fully supporting, and this was not a small investment, a $4 million investment in youth jobs for this summer, to make sure we are offering a youth job to all 5,000 kids, hopefully, to get meaningful employment but do so in a safe way. Again, given COVID, it's obviously had some impact. And then on the pilot side, so we're projecting sort of revenue to be maintained between 21 and 22 to sort of the same amount that we expected this year. I will defer to Nick Arenello to talk a little bit about the pilot process that's kind of going on right now, if he's available for that.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Justin. And thank you for the question, Councillor Burden. As far as the pilot program goes, we're kind of in the midst of the year for collections and about to send out notices for the second half. Our goal every year is to increase the amount of money that we get out of that program. But it's a little too early for me to jinx it by giving you a solid prediction on whether we're going to do amazingly well or the same, or hopefully not at all worse. But the goal every year is to kind of maximize the amount of revenue that we can get from that program. That's something my department works really hard on and has had success on in the past, and hopefully will continue to successfully keep that program being a leader in the nation.
Thank you. Madam Chair, that's all my questions for now.
Great, thank you, Councillor Braden. Next up is Councillor Campbell, and then it'll be Councillor Mejia. Councillor Campbell.
Thank you, Councillor Bach, and thank you, Justin, your entire team, everyone being on the Zoom. I know it's boring to sit here and not say anything. You all look fabulous, so thank you so much. And of course, thank you to all the city employees who've been working really hard in the midst of COVID, of course, to ensure that our residents get services, go through this budget process. So a big thank you to them as well. I also want to thank, of course, Councillor Bach and her team for the work they're already doing to navigate us, take us through the process. So thank you so much. Following up on Councillor Bach's question, which I really appreciated, around the equity inclusion framework, the equity framework, can we get a copy of what that actually looks like, which would be really helpful to the questions that the departments had to go through?
Yep, absolutely.
Perfect. And then also, is it possible, this is, I guess, another information request, a copy of what the department's requests were, right? What they actually requested and then what they got would be really helpful as well.
Sure, I think we can pull that together.
Thank you. And then a few other things. One is, and we can get into the weeds during the actual budget hearings, but particularly because you brought up the federal dollars and a deeper understanding of how much we're getting, what it's for, the strings that are attached. Is there a number right now as to what Boston Public Schools is specifically getting in terms of federal relief dollars? And if so, what is that amount?
Sure, I certainly defer to them. They're a little bit closer to the pulse when it comes to that, but they are getting about $120 million from the December federal package, and that was December 2020. They're also going to get sort of in excess, and I don't have the number, but it's in excess of $200 million in the most recent ARP, American Rescue Plan funding as well. So I think all told, they're probably north of 350, something like that. But I'll defer to them. They're closer to the federal grant process for their programs.
Very helpful. And then one big question is, as you can imagine, there are more and more articles. There was one just this last week on the vacancies in the city, particularly how high our vacancy rate is. What do you anticipate, just from your department, the effect that will have on property, taxes, revenue? Of course, I share the concern of council colleagues with respect to homeowners who, of course, are bearing the brunt of many of these property tax increases. And I'm working with Councilor Bach, Councilor Flynn on responding with some solutions with the state. And we had a very robust working session on this, along with our commissioner, Nick, of course, as well. So I'm just curious, though, given all of these articles that are coming out and folks, left to go to the suburbs, I think they'll be coming back to the city of Boston, of course. But how is that going to affect some of our projections in the future and just our economic situation going forward?
So I'll do high level, and then obviously Nick jump in. So what we always try to frame the property tax conversation in sort of what's in our control and sort of what's not in our control. So the things that are in our control, we're going to maximize the residential exemption for next year. We're going to maximize the shift between commercial and residential. That means sort of we shift the entire, or as much of the responsibility from residents onto the commercial side as possible, which obviously has its own sort of drawbacks to your point around the vacancy issue. The important thing to remember, though, is Boston is considerably below our 2.5% threshold. So you can raise property taxes by 2.5% every year, but you can only raise it up to a 2.5% ceiling of all the value in the city. So the city has seen a tremendous growth in value since the early 1980s, or early 1990s, of about 8% annually. But we've really only increased that levy by 2.5% every year, because we're not like other communities who do Prop 2.5 overrides or anything like that. So I think that, while yes, we sort of echo the concerns, and we are, working within what we can do for sort of a residential exemption and try to keep those taxes down, we are sort of guided by state law. So I think we are trying to work within that and look forward to partnering with you, Councilor, on what a state solution might look like. Nick, anything else I'm sure you could add a whole bunch on values and other programs.
Yeah, no, thank you, Justin. That was a very solid overview, and thank you for your question, Councilor Campbell. To Justin's point, purely from a revenue perspective, the vacancy isn't going to impact the amount of money that the city is going to collect through property taxes. What it potentially impacts is the value on individual properties. And there's really a lot of different factors that kind of go into that. One of them is timing, because of the weird way that property taxes are structured. One of them is also, just because a space looks empty doesn't necessarily mean that it's not producing rent. In which case it wouldn't be considered vacant from a valuation perspective. And so there are a few different pieces that come into play. But as Justin mentioned, and I know concerns about many of the councilors have raised about the impact of property taxes upon our residents, and the work that the city has historically done, and I'm sure will continue to do to try and lessen that burden by utilizing the residential exemption program, by utilizing the personal exemption programs that we have available, the deferral programs, and also the classification shift, all of which, from a perspective of the overall state, makes Boston a very affordable place to live in terms of property taxes compared to surrounding communities.
Okay, and I just one last question, and I will go deeper on the police department budget, the overtime concerns that still are there, even with this budget. I'm not optimistic at all, frankly. Mass and Cass definitely want to see greater investment in plan there. It continues to get worse, not only there, but in other parts of the city with respect to opioid and homelessness crisis. which is the other public health crisis in the city of Boston that does not get the attention it deserves. So I have a lot of questions there, including around racial equity trainings. And, you know, the fire department got $500,000 previous, but hasn't gone through racial equity training as of yet. And so really tough questions around the racial equity piece, which of course is critically important to the work of the city. And then I will just add, and this is my final question, I just saw the gavel. Right now, the status of collective bargaining, you know, what contracts are currently under negotiation? Where are we? And that's my last question, and looking forward to the process going forward. Thank you all. Thank you, Councilor Bach.
Thank you, Councilor Campbell. If you guys want to quickly answer that.
I'll just take the last one. So we are in negotiations with everyone who is out of contract. So there are a bunch that were out of contract in FY21, so this current fiscal year, that we are at the table with. And then there are more who are up in FY22 who we will be getting to the table with once we get through that contract, or once we get through the end of this contract.
Can we have a list of those? That would be really helpful.
Sure. Short answer is most city departments and the police department are open. And the fire department and the school department is obviously their own separate entity, and they're negotiating that, but they're also up in FY22 as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Bach.
Great. Thank you, Councilor Campbell. Next up is Councilor Mejia, and then we'll go to Councilor O'Malley and then Arroyo. Councilor Mejia.
Thank you, Chair, for carrying us through this budget season. This is the second season that our office has been a part of it, and we're excited with the changes that we have made to make sure that the voices of the people are centered in the space. We have already held 3 virtual events to talk about the budget, and we will soon be taking this conversation onto the streets. People want to know what's going on when it comes to how their money is being spent. But because the budget document is 1,000 pages long and these hearings take place during the work day, most people are being kept out of the process. This budget season we'll be fighting for what the people put us in office to demand. And this includes more funding for ELLs and special education, municipal broadband, and reallocating public safety funding towards youth jobs, meaningful civic engagement, and all decision-making processes, and mental health and wellness. Excuse me, as I choke. So there's a few questions. We want to make sure that these hearings this year will help us bring more people into the process. Oh my God, I'm getting all choked up. How is the administration planning to show up in this space in ways that people will actually understand? And that gives us as the council the ability to get most of our questions answered. I'm curious to learn a little bit more about the property tax generated from the tangible personal tax for things like barbershop chairs. How much money does the city take from this specific area of revenue? And how is this assessed, particularly for those who didn't receive, who didn't reply to the notice? I'm just curious. I've gotten some questions about that. The budget presentation stated that there's a 21 million cut in police spending, but last year the police were only budgeted for 404 million, meaning that we went over their allocated budget. My question is, will the BPD go over their budget for FY22? And if that's the case, how can we use our budget book to more accurately reflect what that process, what the proposed is needed? And has the administration been working with the city police? Actually, I'm curious, has the administration been working with the city's police reform task force to make decisions around OPAT structure, executive leadership, et cetera? How do we plan to involve them and the city council in the future of this project? And we're seeing some of the greatest job losses in the food service industry and other industries that are primarily people of color, immigrants, many who are undocumented and low income. How are we using this federal relief spending to put into the hands of the workers who need it most? That's all for now, so I can cough a little bit.
Thank you, Councilor, for the questions. I will try to take them in the order that they came in. So on the engagement side and the public conversation, we really look forward to both building out our own, and I appreciate that the document is long. We're trying to be as transparent as possible. We try to put the numbers out there, and I know it's not an easy document to digest, so we appreciate any and all ideas for how to do it. I think what we're doing in the budget office side is we're trying to engage the people in different types of mediums. So as I mentioned, we are partnering with Modem and a local nonprofit in East Boston around moving through the budget, which is a dance program to help explain the budget. And we hope if that works out well, and that's sort of a successful tool, we can take that citywide. We also hope to have a larger ongoing conversation. One of the things that we were piloting pre-COVID was taking the budget and taking all of my friends in the budget office out to the neighborhood. So we would go to all of the mayor's coffee hours with posters and different types of material written in as simple of or as basic of a language as possible, so that we could give it out to the folks, translating it into different materials, so that we could be available to answer questions as well as that. But look forward to partnering with you both through the council process, but also through your own process. And if you'd like to have the budget office participate in any of your public hearings or your public sessions, we'd be happy to do so. On the police side of things, I'm not familiar with the structure by which we were making decisions around that, so I would have to defer on that question. As far as the budget is, as far as it relates to the budget, we work very closely with the police department to manage within their budget. We do not know what they're going to go over next year because we're not through next year yet. I would say what we have tried to do is set a realistic but significant cut to their overtime budget, make investments in areas that will help us achieve that through more officers in the overall force and more officers coming back from medical leave to help fill those slots on regular time, so as opposed to overtime. And then it's going to be obviously an ongoing process to hold the police department and the city accountable to hit that number. So we are sort of trying to make a mindful cut. We're trying to make a significant cut, but we're doing it in a way that is responsible and achievable for next year. The last question around the hardest hit industries. So I think there's really two facets that we're trying to address hard hit industries. One is using some of this federal money directly for hard hit industries. That's both tourism, hospitality, small businesses, as well as investments in mobility, job training, and arts job training, which we're excited about, who have been particularly impacted by COVID-19. And I think as we think about this larger federal funding that we'll be talking to the council about in the coming months, I think that supporting small businesses and supporting hard hit industries will be a central pillar of that conversation. And the last question I will kick to Nick, because it was about personal property taxes, which he is an expert on.
Actually, it was about business. It's personal taxes, but it's for businesses. So Nick, you can just give us some insight around that.
No, I would be happy to. Thank you, Justin, and thank you, Councilor Mejia. So yeah, the taxes for business that you're talking about, we do refer to as personal property taxes. So in fiscal year 21, those accounted for just over $187 million in revenue. That's out of the $2.67 billion that the city collected overall through the property tax levy. The way that works is there's a self-reporting obligation for every owner of personal property in the city. It's this form called a formal list, and they're supposed to file every year by March 1st with the department. If someone does not file, my team does a lot of work every year to discover new accounts or discover people that possibly did not file, in which case we create estimates and send out bills. A few different ways that we do that. Overall, the area of personal property law is surprisingly complex. Whether something's taxable or exempt depends a lot on the type of the owner of the property. So you get the same business, and if you're organized as a corporation, then the rules as to what gets taxed at the local level are different than if you're an LLC or unincorporated sole proprietorship. And so there's no kind of one quick answer to your question, because it really depends on a whole bunch of different factors. But if there's a particular constituent that has a question, or if your office has any questions, or anyone has any questions, my personal property folks would be happy to kind of help resolve those and get into more details, kind of with more of a situational fact pattern. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. Oh, is that the gavel? Oh, dag. Okay. Well, I'll be following up via email, Nick. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia. And I agree, Nick. It would be great to understand a little more. I think I've certainly had constituents ask how consistently we apply that personal property tax. I think when it hits people for the first time and they didn't have it before, then they're like, well, who else is not getting this notice? And my understanding is that it was a very core component of the city's tax structure 100 years ago, and sort of things have shifted. And I don't know. I agree. I just want to second Councilor Mejia that I think there's some confusion out there, so it's something we should follow up on. All right, next up is Councilor O'Malley, and then Councilor Arroyo and Councilor Baker. Councilor O'Malley.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, Chief Sterrett, and to your entire team. It's great to see you all. I always enjoy this inaugural budget hearing, truly, because I think it allows us to get a deeper dive than we received in the acting mayor's briefing a couple weeks ago, and allows us to articulate what our true sort of focus is, and really just get a good lay of the land. So I appreciate all of you for taking this time. It is perhaps surprising to no one that a focus of mine for this, my final budget season as a councillor, is clearly on climate resiliency, environmental justice, what we're doing there. I know there's been some increase. I know we're losing a tremendous chief in Chief Cook, but really excited about his successor, someone with whom I've worked for many, many years, and excited for Chief White Hammond to continue the work that I know we all know is so important. And so as we get more specific to her cabinet hearings, but honestly looking for a real focus on trash collection, how we pick it up. This week starts yard waste and refuse pickup, which is great. Other ways that we can divert from the land waste stream, as well as some of our infrastructure, particularly our climate-related infrastructure. Because of work of this council, we now, I'm one of the countless Bostonians who gets 100% of his electricity from renewable energy sources, but it would be great if we could actually have some Boston-based renewable energy sources. So what it's looking like for our building out of our infrastructure. Similarly, it'd be no surprise that the focus, myself, and I would venture guess every councillor, is on Boston Public Schools. There's no question that this has been the most difficult year imaginable for BPS, and I appreciate some things that were done exceptionally well, particularly around food access and technological access and limiting the technological divide or digital divide. But there's still a tremendous amount of concern we have, not the least of which is this is my 11th budget season. The city's population has grown exponentially in the last decade, yet BPS's student enrollment has dipped. So that's something that I have a lot of concern as we get into the superintendent, her team. And then finally, as it relates to basic infrastructure and how we're going to look at applying particularly some of the ARP funds to making Boston a better, more resilient, more equitable city going forward as it relates to infrastructure. You know, I think one thing that's really, really interested in, and actually, Nick, this is my long-winded way of getting into my questions, is as we think about a post-pandemic life, how the world is going to change. I mean, I think that one thing is clear, and I see it when I'm downtown and the number of businesses that have shuttered. Many more people will be working from home. What does that do to our commercial tax base, which has always been where we've put our thumb on the scale, quite frankly, on our revenue? So what does that look like? Do the fact that we have seen an increase in our residential rates, is that a proactive move to limit the fact that the balance has to be a little bit more equal between residential and commercial going forward? I don't know, perhaps it is. I think that the commercial value, or the residential value will continue to grow. We see it in our neighborhoods where houses won't even make it to an open house and go for $50,000, $60,000, $80,000 over asking. I mean, the real estate in Boston has never been hotter than it is right now on the residential side. I'm sure the commercial is a very, very different mood. And that's one thing that we have to address and really plan for, because as my colleagues know and the folks in the budget office know, for many, many years, we really were putting more of the onus on the commercial side of property taxes. Finally, as it relates to public health, this sort of the fourth big focus of mine. I remarked the other day to my wife that this is the first year probably in my life that I didn't have a cold. And like many of you, I shake more hands than the average person in a non-pandemic time. But I think it underscores how public health is so much more at the forefront, obviously. So I'm delighted to see an increase in public health. I think it should be increased even more than that, and how we're really going to make sure that Boston remains a healthful city and a healthier post-pandemic city going forward. So I look forward to getting into it with Chief Martinez and his team as well. Very briefly, before the gavel goes up, I guess Nick or Justin, you can start with that. Talk a little bit about the difference in residential versus commercial real estate right now and what that means going forward for what our property taxes on both are going to look like in this year and in the successive years.
I'll just say, and then turn over to Nick, from a top line, we are not changing the way we approach the distinction between commercial and residential. We are not sort of shifting the scale than what we have already, which is fully shifted onto the commercial side, and we are still maximizing the residential exemption. So from that perspective, we are not changing our approach. Obviously, we've heard a lot from homeowners, as many of you have, about the tax increase, and it is purely derived from exactly what you said. You have $60,000 over asking price. That's going to drive up values, which is going to obviously lead to increase in your own value, which is going to lead into taxes. So despite the fact that we are maximizing on the commercial side and obviously still supporting the full residential exemption, we sort of do have to follow state law, and we do have to be mindful of the commercial side, right? So even if we were to sort of have the ability to go even further on the scale, I'm not sure if we should, because there's obviously a tremendous amount of pressure on the commercial side of landlords right now that I think would warrant discussion. But I'll turn it over to Nick, who can certainly talk through the nuts and bolts of the value side.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you for your question, Councilor O'Malley. The question you ask is really interesting to think about. It's a really interesting economic question to think about, just like what is the future of our city going to look like? And it's a question that a lot of people are asking around the country. And I think part of the reason there's so much speculation is that everything right now is just kind of such a huge unknown. The pandemic was unprecedented. It did not do the kinds of things to our local economy that other recessions have done. It came on very quickly, and we're still kind of trying to figure out what that looks like. But just kind of one of the things that you raised, the fact that the residential market stayed strong and is strengthening is not normally how recessions work,
Sure.
right? So normally that's something that is spread across all areas. And it's interesting now to kind of look at that and figure out, is there a bigger commercial impact than residential? I think that the fact that residential is growing is itself going to have a bigger impact. And the commercial market is still such an unknown as to kind of how that's going to bounce back, that figuring out what that's going to look like and projecting is just really challenging to do.
Fair enough. Nick, I'm sorry. I want to get two quick ones in, but I think suffice it to say, wait and see. We're all, uncharted territory here on commercial, but I appreciate that. Sorry to interrupt. Very briefly, Justin, when I worked for county government, I worked for Sheriff Cabral. This is going back 15 years. County would get deeds excise funds from the city every year to the tune of, it could be in the millions of dollars. Does that still exist with the essentially dissolution of county government? Are you aware?
No, deeds excise go to the Nick, you might know this better than I. Deeds excise go to the state through the Secretary of State's office, and
then that goes.
That's why they.
Fair enough. Used to go specifically to the county, but now the state.
My state budget predecessors are rolling over in their grave that I don't remember the answer to that question.
Quite all right. And then finally, with ARP funds that will come to Boston as the pass through for the rest of Suffolk County, Chelsea, Winthrop, and Revere, is there a percentage on how much will go to each municipality? Is it derived by population?
Exactly. Yeah, population based.
Great. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks so much, Councilor O'Malley. Yeah, and I think the deeds excises are also helping to pay for the CPA, right? So they are coming to the city in some sense, but not in full form. Okay, Councilor Arroyo, then Councilor Baker, and Councilor Flynn. Councilor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair, just for shepherding all of this and in advance for all of the time you're going to be spending on Zoom with this. So I'm going to try and keep this incredibly brief because I know that most of my colleagues have asked these questions already, and so I don't have to retread them. So just two things. One, I see that OPAT is scheduled for, I believe, $1 million. Do we believe that'll be the extent of what they need? And how do we come to that conclusion? And then on the pilot, I know that Liz Braden also mentioned this, but I just want to know what the plans are, if any, to sort of expand pilot and develop it as a revenue source for the city. moving forward. And those are the only two I have for today. Thank you, Madam Chair, and to the panelists.
Thank you, Councilor. I'll take the first and then I'll kick the second one over to Nick. On OPAT, basically the task force laid out sort of what the roles and responsibilities of that organization were going to be. And we basically then worked sort of internally to try to determine what type of staffing they might need. And that's where we came up with the 10 staffers plus obviously some non-personnel supports. I don't know if that'll be the final budget for the long-term size of the office. I could certainly see it growing over time depending on the types of, the caseload it's working on or the types of investigations it's doing and the needs. I think $1 million is a big investment for a first year department. And I think our goal will be to sort of fully staff that office with that $1 million and then reevaluate in 23 and beyond. On the pilot side, I think it's obviously something that we continue to work with our pilot counterparts on. We're obviously mindful though that many of them have been impacted financially from COVID-19, whether it's, schools who were not open this year or hospitals who, were not providing, the same types of in-person services that they normally provide that generates revenue for them. Nick, can you give an update on where you are with the process for evaluating pilot?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Justin. Thank you for your question, Councilor Arroyo. So yeah, pilot, we are kind of in the midst of pushing for revenue for fiscal year 21. There were some definite impacts in terms of timing and our request for fiscal year 20, which kind of led to some delays in our request for 21, but it is a program that we are always evaluating because our primary goal is to maintain our nation leading program. And we are always, aside from maintenance, continuing to push to figure out ways to improve, enhance outreach, enhance participation, and both in the number of organizations that participate as well as the level to which they participate. But it's something that we're kind of always continuously working on and trying to figure out ways to improve.
Councilor Arroyo, anything further?
Nope, just thank you in advance. This will be probably the only time in the history of the Zoom budget hearings that I don't get the gavel pulled on me. So I just wanted to appreciate this moment. Thank you, everybody.
No, absolutely. There's plenty of time ahead. All right, Councilor Baker and then Councilor Flynn, and then I'll follow up with a few more questions. We will have a second round if there are councilors who have further questions. Councilor Flynn, sorry, Councilor Baker, my apologies.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hello, Justin. Good morning, and also to your team. Thank you, everybody, for coming out and helping us through this budget here. So, Justin, the 40 million OPEB, we had planned on that anyway. We can't use the Fed money on OPEB.
No, I don't believe so.
The pension liability.
No, there's two reasons. One, it's excluded from pension payments. It's also sort of runs contrary to what we're trying to do with this money, which is supposed to be for one-time things or things that we sort of have a resource for. So no, I don't think so.
So the 50 million in lost revenue that's coming from the Fed money, that's just whatever we project for what we had projected for excise tax and meals tax, we'll try and plug that in there as best we can. Is that safe to say that?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's going to be it's going to be an evolving process because we sort of have a set baseline of what the minimum we think is we're going to collect next year, but depending on how things come back, it may change a little bit. But we'll sort of evaluate as we get into next year.
Yeah. So that money will be a saving. That money will be a saving grace, and it's not necessarily attached to the budget. So it's automatically going to get placed in those places. Like even if this budget did not pass, that money would still be able to go and fill those holes and do those sorts of things, the backstop sort of money.
Well, the ARP money, when we get notice from the federal government, we will file an accept and expend order with the council, of which a portion of it will go towards the general fund to support the 22 operating budget. So I think the ARP and the federal money will be, the ARP and the city budget will be connected. So we won't be able to have one without the other without making cuts on the budget side to make up for that lost revenue.
Yeah.
But there will be sort of separate votes.
And so when you call it a tranche, you call when the first tranche comes in. So that'll be for 215 million. Is the administration going to come to the city council with a $215 million accept and expend? And then that goes over to you? Is that how that's going to work?
So I think we're going to wait till we get the final guidance on what the order will look like. But yes, we will come to the council to do an accept and expend for that $215 million, of which we're proposing to dedicate $100 million to support the city budget. And then $115 million we would propose through these outside grants or these outside programs, of which we look forward to having a conversation about council priorities, obviously the public priorities. But that's why we've stood up this equitable recovery resource task force, was around this idea that we don't know exactly where all the needs are yet. And we want to have a public conversation about it to inform that decision.
Is that the committee you were talking about?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's a task force or committee. A committee seems like something that should be in city council. And quite frankly, I think these I would want to see money broken down more prescriptively than just the 215 million. Then that's just a blank check for you guys. Not that I'm saying you wouldn't know what to do with it. I have total faith in you. But I would like to see that 215 million when it comes to the city council broken down a little. Maybe it's a we start with the 215 million, but there's a hook in there that as we're coming back and it starts to move and starts to go out the door, that it comes back and in front of us. Or, talking to my colleagues, we should be thinking about how we do that on our own. So let's think about that moving forward, Justin. And the committee again, and that's,
so it's
those discussions normally would happen in a city council, in the city council, I would think, because we ultimately give the okay for the money. So to set up a committee that's looks to me like is going to be in front of the city council, I think maybe cheapens our job a bit.
Sure.
So I'd like to make sure that we, as the city council, are being spoken to first before we start with task force and committees of advocates and community members, because as we all know, this is our job to keep an eye on the city budget. So I would make that as a hard request to the administration through you, Justin, that we are brought up to speed on this money and where it's going to go before we start going to advocates and to community people.
Yep. And that's sort of why we haven't formally launched the committee yet. We want to have that conversation with you all as part of the appropriation and accept and expend process. Once we hear from the feds, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we will file that order, and then we are more than happy to come and do hearings on the topic.
Yeah, because our new president pro tempore, I think that's how you say it, Matt, correct? Set up a committee specifically for us to be able to keep an eye on this money here. So, and another thing that I don't hear about with money going to business that's affected in rental backstops and different programs like that. What about the homeowners? What about the people that actually own homes? And as we've established already, 75% of our budget is based on people that own here in Boston. So is there going to be anything there for if people have fallen behind on their mortgages, especially if they're granting rental relief to people? Is there going to be a place for the landlord to come and possibly be at the table here?
Sure. So I would certainly encourage any landlord who is has tenants to contact the rental relief fund. That's a $50 million fund that is set up designed to help pay the rent of folks, which would ultimately go to the landlord. So I certainly would encourage all those landlords to access that money that has been approved already by the council. And thank you for that. So I would certainly target that.
And maybe just in our speaking points, in our talking points, so people that own here and live here, they know that they're part of this, because we never hear about the landlord. We never hear about the people that own the building. So just as we're moving forward, please talk about the landlords. We've spoken a lot about, I've heard a lot about Mass and Cass. A couple of us are on the task force down there, and talk about feeling like I'm on a hamster wheel. Now at this point, Justin, we've been asking for bathrooms. We've been asking for a whole number of things. Nothing has seemed to come to fruition. We have the outreach team through the police department that has, I think they had 5 people, and we're giving them some money. I think they're at 15 people, but they're getting removed from their office down there at Mass and Cass. We're looking for a command center where we can answer all the calls, not just the police calls down there, but calls for, fecal matter on the doorsteps, needles here, just a general cleanup from Public Works. We need a real city response down there. It's time for us to start actual items that we've been asking for the task force for a couple of years here now. We've been asking for bathrooms for over a year. Last summer was ridiculous, the amount of calls that we got for people using hallways and stairways and front steps and back steps as bathrooms and different things like that. Public health owns land all along that Miranda Kramer building there. The whole thing looks like it's empty to me. Why don't we have a command center in there that the outreach team can be with the best team clinicians, with Public Works, with transportation, with EMS. We're going to need those things if we're really going to get in front of this problem on Mass and Cass. We need to support the city departments other than public health down there. But not that I'm not saying don't support public health, but the response down there is 5, 6, 7 pronged. It's public health. It's emergency medical services. It's the police department. It's Public Works. It's everybody down there. So we need to start really supporting people down there. You had talked about the public needle return, which I brought that machine that cleanses all the old needles and grinds. And I brought that to Public Health about 6 years ago. Nothing ever happened with it. So the time of talk is getting old. The people in the South End, the people in Lower Roxbury, the people in Newmarket are really getting tired. The city really needs to deliver some things. I look at places like Lawrence and Lowell and even Chelsea. They all have mobile vaccinations and mobile testing. We weren't even able, as the city of Boston, the driving economic engine of the whole region, we weren't even able to get a single mobile bathroom in a year. And we're watching towns that don't have the capabilities we have. They're in front of us. So at what point are the things that the task force are asking for, at what point are we going to be paid attention to and have some of those things delivered to us? That's big for me. And also, I think Council Campbell asked for it earlier, the list of questions that are asked around, I'm looking to get speed bumps in different places. And so now there's if something's been approved, there's a whole new list of questions that need to be asked for speed bumps or sidewalks to be approved. Did I hear that correctly?
Sure. No. So that would be a little bit more on the department side of things. So right now, BTD and Public Works, they do their own equity analysis. What the Councilor Campbell asked about was our new equity framework with budget decisions. So it's more so we want to make $1 million investment in X, and what equity frameworks have you gone through, but not speed bump by speed bump. That doesn't.
Well, I mean, because going back a year ago or maybe a year and a half ago, there was some talk about traditional neighborhoods that know how to advocate for themselves kind of be put on the back burner. And I think if places have children on the street and they need speed bumps, we should look at it for need. And I just want to make sure that neighborhoods that have been in line for things like that are going to get them this year. Because I mean, I've literally been asking for speed bumps for certain neighborhoods throughout my whole district for probably 7 years now. And I've yet to get one in my district, one speed bump.
So
please,
I would say this is separate than the slow streets program that obviously BTD runs, where they do 3 or 4 through a competitive process. So that was not only funded in this year's budget, but we added funding for new neighborhoods to come online as well. So that process is still running, and that's a sort of separate process.
And how long has the Safe Streets program been in play? 3 years?
I think so. 3 years.
5
that sounds
or
about right.
more.
Councilor
Okay.
Baker, do you just
Yeah.
have to, just because we've run.
Just
past
wrap it
time.
up. Okay, yeah, I got, yeah. So I'm just looking through the departments. Like, I feel like in many areas of my requests, I'm on a treadmill here, and I'm looking to move some things along, so.
Very fair, Counselor, and happy to continue to work with you. I would add that within and I know this is not specific to bathrooms, but I think it is specific to your concerns. We did add 500,000 to PHC's budget to address some of the mass and cast issues, of which 125,000 is dedicated just for cleanliness and sanitation services down there. So I will not say it's for bathroom. I think
That's still not a bathroom though, Justin.
I would defer to PHC and the task force for those conversations.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Baker. And I do think that it came up in our budget process last year that there was going to be a process for transportation to do sort of more surgical strikes on the speed bump front, and I'm not sure that we've seen that in reality. So I think it's something for us to follow up at the BTD hearing on. All right, Councilor Flynn.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Bach, Chair Bach. Thank you, Justin and Nick and your team as well. I'd like to thank you for your work, especially during this difficult, uncertain times. Councilor Flaherty and some of my colleagues already mentioned some of the items already, but I'd like to reiterate some of my priorities as well. Commissioner Arenello knows from coming to the hearings we had in meetings with neighbors, many residents across the city in my neighborhood of South Boston believe the latest property tax increase is a defining moment here where people are now unfortunately considering leaving Boston. They're paying huge property tax and their basic city services, in their opinion, are declining. Their quality of life is declining. So when you put up a beautiful building next to a residential, a retired city worker, it might make their value of their home more profitable, but it also their property tax goes up. They're barely able to stay in the city now. We need to do something about that. We're longtime residents. We should not be kicking them out of Boston. We should be encouraging them to stay here based on fair property tax assessments. Certainly, we can have a deeper discussion about that, and I know we have in the past with your team to see what type of relief we can provide neighbors, either increasing existing exemptions or creating new categories for longtime neighbors to help them remain in the city. They built Boston, in my opinion. I also want to advocate for more police, public safety resources in our city. People know that I've consistently advocated for several hundred police that need to be hired each year. We lose about 100 police officers each year through retirement. Boston police are forced to work overtime, sometimes a double shift. We've seen several shootings that they had to respond to this weekend. Difficult time for the Boston police. I know Boston police during the recent trial were also on overtime as well. Those numbers will continue to go up. People across my district in South Boston were alarmed about the public safety issue we had recently at Moakley Park. I talked to young people. I talked to these young athletes. I talked to coaches. So I was with Councilor Sabi George over in Dorchester. We talked to the same group over at Garvey Park that were playing that night in South Boston, including Council Flaherty was with us. So residents are alarmed about these public safety issues. Traffic safety, need for more enforcement, whether it's Boston Police or Transportation Department, a strict department that does traffic enforcement. It's critical. Councilor Baker talked a lot about, and Councilor Campbell talked a lot about mental health and behavioral health issues. I've seen a lot of that as a result of Mass Ave, Albany Street, in the Andrew Square area. I represent a good portion of the South End also. Finally, we have seen large house parties in South Boston. the critical role inspectional services play to place them on problem properties. We need Boston Police also to continue to play an active role as well. C6 covers too large of a police jurisdiction. We cover basically from the Moakley Courthouse to Harbor Point over to Mass Ave, Albany Street. I think the population in District 2 has gone up 100% over the last 15 years. I continually ask for more police and more support from Captain Boyle, who's been excellent. Captain Sweeney's been excellent, and Captain Chiolo as well. We had a dedicated police bike unit in the south end. That needs to come back. I don't know how things will get better with reduced police resources, unfortunately. Last year, we dealt with fireworks as well. Again, inspectional services for these large house parties. I spent my whole weekend chasing house parties in South Boston. Inspectional services are doing a good job, but we need more of them. We desperately need more inspectors that will also deal with pest and rodent control. Airbnb seems to making some progress to open up again here in our city at the expense of our union hotel workers, in my opinion. Many of them are Asian, many of them Black, many of them brown, women in these hotels. And what we're doing is we want to give Airbnb another chance to come back into the city. Infrastructure, pedestrian safety improvements. Like my colleagues mentioned, speed bumps at Ellen 6 in South Boston, a rapid flash beacon on East Broadway. Transportation team is doing a good job, but they need the resources. We need raised crosswalks, speed bumps, like other cities and towns have throughout. Curb bump outs, extensions for shorter crosswalks. Pedestrian safety is one of the biggest issues we face, and it's something I've been working on since day one. Our trees are dying because of the gas leaks. Mothers Out Front is a group I continually work with. Residents throughout District 2 want trees, whether it's the South End or the Bay Village. Residents in Fort Point are concerned about climate resiliency with the flooding we've seen in recent years. Concerns about not having adequate police, fire, EMS presence in that area as well. Chinatown residents have discussed the need for trash, recycling, composting to improve the cleanliness of our neighborhoods, getting our restaurants back off the ground. We've seen anti-Asian racism that has devastated my community in Chinatown. I'm not happy about it. We need to beef up the Human Rights Commission. Zero tolerance for any of this nonsense. We need a state-of-the-art library in Chinatown. I think we're getting that. We need it in South Boston. We need it in the South End as well. Again, BTD enforcement is critical. Neighbors from all D2 communities also talk about senior housing, youth sports for our young people. Those are just a handful of the issues. I know my time is short, but I could go on and on for another 45 minutes. But at this time, I will stop and just ask Justin if you can give me maybe a quick response to some of these issues I highlighted.
Sure, Councilor. Happy to give you some just high-level thoughts on some of that. But I agree, and I think the budget proposal by Mayor Janey shares a lot of those concerns that you've raised, and I think makes investments to that effect. I'll start with the Human Rights Commission. So we did add $100,000 to their budget to do direct post-COVID-19 investments around discrimination. So I hope that that'll certainly not address all the concerns, but it will help allow them to respond more robustly in the next fiscal year. On the police side, obviously, worthy of discussion, and certainly our investments around, the medical triage unit and getting more officers back off leave, as well as 2 125-person classes funded in next year's budget, will help grow the size of the force and grow the available officers to address, I think, both the public safety concerns you've raised, as well as the overtime concerns that I think many of your colleagues have raised as well. So I think it's a little bit of a dual-pronged approach that we're working on for that. As far as the transportation side goes, I would certainly welcome additional conversations around that. I would say one of the signature pieces in this budget is a $25 million investment in the capital plan around pedestrian ramps to get every single pedestrian ramp up to ADA compliance by the year 2030, which is a massive undertaking by the city to make a really robust investment in street safety and pedestrian safety. So that is obviously a long-term investment and something that we're proud to talk about and happy to flesh out as part of the capital plan process going forward. I think generally speaking, we share many of the concerns that I think you've raised today and look forward to diving in deeper on any specific areas with those departments.
Justin, a quick question. During the recent trial last week, did we spend a lot of money on police overtime?
I don't believe we'll have that information until we run payroll for the next 2 weeks, but I can certainly get you that information.
What are your thoughts right now? We probably had a lot of police that were on forced overtime during that 5 or 6 days. Is that accurate?
I wouldn't want to speculate, Counselor. I think it's fair to say there's probably an increase than a normal day, but I don't have the extent of the full BPD operational plan that was used for that, so I don't want to speculate.
Does anyone else on this call have a little bit of information about that?
I don't think so, Counselor. We can follow up with you on that.
Okay, that's important for me to know because, there'll be, during these critical times across the country, we rely on our police officers, to be there for us. So it's no fault of their own that they're forced to work these overtime shifts, and they're needed. But also, Justin, that goes to show you that we need to hire consistently several hundred police officers every year in the city for the next 10 years. And my residents, my constituents in the South End are asking me for more police. My constituents in Chinatown and downtown are asking me for more police, as are South Boston residents. So, I would like more police officers walking the streets. That's a critical part of this budget process, is to make sure our streets are safe for residents, for our seniors, for persons with disabilities. So I hope we can continue having that conversation, but that's real important, Justin. I hope we all understand that.
Yep. Thank you, Counselor. I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Counselor Flynn. A few more questions from me, and then I am going to let Pam Coker, who's joined us from the Boston Municipal Research Bureau, get in her testimony just because she's been waiting. And then I will do a quick second round of questions for counselors who want them, so you can shoot me a text, let me know if you want a second round or not, but I'll just run through who's remaining. So I guess on my end, since this is our revenue hearing and we have our revenue folks here, I wonder, Maura and Nick, if you guys can walk us through a little bit because of when we do our budget process, we're always flying a little bit blind in terms of revenue on a few different fronts. I think last year what we were flying blind on was, how bad and how long is the, pandemic going to be? And now it's the same thing, but transformed, where we're wondering about how quick the recovery is. And certainly, looking at those numbers, it feels appropriately conservative to me. It also feels like I look at that and I say, gee, I hope that the year that starts July 1 is going to have better excise tax revenues than last year. So I'm just wondering if you can speak to, will we get an update in May from the state on the excise front? What's the point in the year? In my head, it's January that we kind of know about new growth, but I just wonder if you could walk us through, from the council's perspective, what those kind of calendar points are where we kind of get a clearer revenue picture. And sorry, Justin, I didn't mean to go straight to your staff. You're welcome.
No, they're the experts. I'll just say we're very mindful that this is an evolving process. And while I think our estimates are accurate, I think that we tend to naturally err on the side of conservatism. And I think that's why we're very mindful that this federal funding could be used to do revenue replacement next year. So I think we want to there's going to be a little bit of a balancing act when it comes to the federal money versus lost revenue going forward over the next year. Nick, I'd love to have you give an update on just the timeline for new growth and sort of when we think about what that new growth number might look like. And then more, if you want to talk about sort of the process by which we went through, or the process you went through to sort of make our make our determinations around excise taxes and how we came up with those numbers.
Sure. Thank you, Justin, and thank you, Madam Chair Bach. So new growth timing is a long, involved process, unfortunately, and it does not, the certainty with when we have the new growth number is in that kind of late November, early December timeframe, right in line with when we're approving the tax rate for the fiscal year. And right now we're in the information gathering phase. And so I know for the past few years, there's been kind of a discrepancy between projections and actual results. And it, you know, that is a big part of that function is, as Justin just mentioned, kind of the desire to be conservative in our estimates, because the last thing that we want to do is project more revenue than we're going to collect. This year is definitely going to be a challenging year to kind of figure out what that is and what that impact is. There are a few different elements that kind of go into that. One is that there's the construction pause.
I'm not sure I understand.
That wasn't me, was it? Anyway, the construction pause kind of delayed projects that were in the pipeline and then pushes their completion date out further into the future. And so when we're looking back at January 1st and kind of what was done at that point in time, that pause has a potential impact on new growth. And then also the potential of commercial value not appreciating at the same rate that it potentially has in the past is something. When those new projects come online, the valuation might not be as substantial as it was in the past few years. And so those are some of the things that lead into that kind of lower revenue estimate. I know I talked for a long time on these things, so let me give more a chance to kind of answer some of the other questions.
Yeah, thanks. So it's just like what we've been saying all along, but there are so many unknowns when we're thinking about all of our revenue and excise in particular, and particularly in the last, let's say, year and a half. Just to think about how we look at excise, basically, we get from the state a quarterly payment, which covers 3 months of the year. And there's always a 2-month lag. So for example, the next payment we're going to get is we're going to receive it mid-June, and it's going to be for a time period that is a 2-month lag. So that's going to be February, March, and April. So even when we get the next payment, we're still not going to see the hopefully exciting reopening that we're starting to see right now when people are coming to the city, staying in hotels and eating out. So that lag is another problem in our projection. But what we do is every month the state publishes what their excise collection was. It's not specific to Boston, it's for the state. But from that, we can do some extrapolation to figure out how Boston is going to be impacted. So that's one way that we go about when we're thinking about excise. A problem is that one
of the interesting things that we found is that Boston did worse comparatively than the Berkshires and Cape Cod in tourism, because people were still sort of vacationing last summer, but people just didn't really come to Boston last summer. So it's even thrown off some of our own statewide calculations that we run, because we weren't able to extrapolate the same way we normally would, where Boston sort of represents, whatever, 20% of the monthly excise tax revenue. That number was way down compared to normal times because people were visiting Cape Cod and the Berkshires and not Boston.
Right, and that was very important both for the room occupancy, so hotels and Airbnb, but also for restaurants. So all of the people living in the suburbs, they usually would come to the city to enjoy our excellent restaurants. Right now, they don't want to do it. So either they will do delivery and then maybe we'll get some of it, or they will just go to the local restaurant in their own hometown, and then Boston is not enjoying all of these visitors, even from around the city. So that definitely was an issue for us. Our problem last year was, and when we were having these exact discussions in April through June, we decreased our excise projections, and sadly we were not close. And that never happened to me before, but I was too optimistic on revenue collection. But because this is such a unique place that we are in time. So when we set up the budget right now, and we could do some updates in June when we're talking about the resubmission, we're not going to have that much more information. But when we're working on the tax rate budget in November and December, when we have the new growth number, we're also going to have 6 months more of excise information, and that will allow us to do updates for our, it's going to be mostly excise, but it could be other revenue sources. But excise is definitely such a big question mark still to this very day, unfortunately.
To Maura's point, it's always a balancing act, right? So for as conservative as we are on new growth, that helps make up for the sort of outsized losses that we experience on the excise tax front. So it's always going to be a balancing act, and it's certainly not on Moore or frankly on anyone on projecting around revenue in a pandemic, right? This was not a recession. This was not a sort of a slowdown in the economy. This was a worldwide pandemic that had public health measures that, you know, even in past recessions, people still went out to eat, people still went to college, still people, you know, traveled to visit family. That just didn't happen for 12 months. So it was basically, it was very difficult for us to make projections around that. But we've dialed that in, and we feel very strongly we've created a new sort of post-pandemic normal. And I think that everything above where we're projecting now is really on the upside for the most part.
And I think just the last thing I would add is that what we are hoping to see is all this pent up demand of people just dying to start spending their money and going to restaurants and staying in hotels. And I really hope that that is what is going to happen, hopefully this summer, but definitely once things start to get back to like a more normal, post-pandemic normal is what we're calling it.
Great. Thank you. No, and certainly I'm not suggesting that you all should have been more wizardly in predicting the course of the pandemic than you were. I think that it's more, it's more a question. I mean, Councilor Baker alluded to this too. I said it up top. You know, I think for the council, it's important to be exercising democratic oversight and accountability on the federal funding. And I think that so much of the proposal for how to use the federal funding has to do with maintaining optionality depending on how these numbers come in. But I think that one of the things that does is it pushes a lot of the decision points in the proposal kind of in terms of what the money actually gets used on past the moment of council accountability. So I'm trying to think as a Ways and Means Chair about how to how we should approach that appropriately. I certainly agree with Councilor Baker that, we value hugely our department's input, and we're looking forward to the input of that committee, but it's not going to substitute for council committee work. So, but as you said, Chief Starr, we've got time ahead to work on that in May. All right, well, that was my follow-up on revenue. I want to go now to Pam Coker from the Boston Municipal Research Bureau, let her say a word, and then I'll just quickly check if colleagues have follow-up questions before we wrap up. So Pam? Pam, I don't know if you can hear me, but you're in, but you're muted. There we go.
Thank you. It looks like my camera is not working at the very moment, so I will have to give this to you with a black box. Thank you for this opportunity to speak at this first fiscal year 2022 budget hearing. My name is Pam Coker. I am the president of the Boston Municipal Research Bureau, and I'm also a city resident. And the fiscal health of the city of Boston is a high priority for the Research Bureau as we address issues related to financial management, governance, and other key policy matters so that the city can do what it needs to do and wants to do for the Boston community, even during challenging times such as these. The federal funds available to Boston due to the COVID pandemic has tremendous potential to impact the fiscal year 2020 budget in many ways. And we've heard about many of those potential impacts already in testimony this morning. As we've heard, the city is estimated to receive as much as $435 million in federal funding as part of the American Rescue Plan Act, beginning this spring through fiscal year 2025. To address the needs of the city, the Boston Public Schools, and other local organizations over the next 5 fiscal years. This is an extraordinary amount of resources for an extraordinary time. And yes, these federal funds will help the city to continue to provide essential services to the Boston community, despite facing revenue reductions due to the pandemic and the economic recession. But my greatest point here this morning is It is so critical that the city is planning now, not only for the use of these federal funds while they last, but also planning now for the day these funds are no longer available. It's equally important as addressing the city's current challenges with the federal funds to plan for the use of these federal funds with a focus on the potential impact when these funds are spent. As a one-time resource, the anticipated $435 million of federal funds should be used for one-time needs or for revenue replacement, replenishing reserves, and other stopgap measures in order to prevent a fiscal cliff such as experienced with ERA funding in response to the Great Recession. We should be using our one-time money wisely and planning for sustaining city services, including the potential need for the city to address, after federal funds are spent, the long-term needs of residents hardest hit by the pandemic's impact. And then there are several areas of the proposed budget we believe need more conversation during the budget hearings going forward. The BPD's 5.1 budget cut, they attribute to a substantial reduction in overtime, while at the same time hiring more officers. The addition of $1.75 million to the Office of Health and Human Services budget to develop alternative policing strategies. The city's efforts in recovery, reopening, and renewal, including investments in a variety of programs and initiatives in housing and homeless resources, local business support and job training, and advancing equitable recovery. Again, the city will need to be attentive to the potential for our community's longer-term needs for these programs. We also look forward to the assessing department hearing and the opportunity there to talk about specifics on the determination of the fiscal year 2022 new growth number, given the disparity between the fiscal year 21 new growth budgeted number versus actual new growth in fiscal year 21. And then from various city department heads, we look forward to hearing during the coming month more about the continued tightening within city departments as described in the city's budget book and what that specifically actually means, what is being tightened, to what degree, as the city emphasizes that this is an opportunity, this tightening to enable the city to afford targeted investments after reserving for costs associated with collective bargaining, funding its pension obligations, and paying debt service. And then we also look forward to hearing more about the establishment of new programs and offices, even during this challenging time, particularly to meet particularly to address the issues that have come up in the past year related to the pandemic and policing challenges. So for that, we're interested in hearing this conversation about the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency with their appropriation of $1 million. The $1.75 million investment to Health and Human Services to develop a program of alternative policing. Learning more about the new Equity Cabinet, including 2 new departments, the Office of Equity and the Office of Language and Communications Access, joining existing departments within the new Equity Cabinet. At the same time, I'd just like to touch on the administration's proposal does include that highly anticipated implementation of the state's Student Opportunity Act beginning in fiscal year 2022. This presents a long-awaited, long-term recognition of Boston Public School student needs with a substantial increase to Boston's Chapter 70 funding and a commitment to fully fund the city's charter school tuition reimbursement. And that's a state commitment to fully fund what they should be sending the city all along for tuition reimbursement. And then lastly, I note the continuation of the city's commitment to funding fixed costs, such as pensions and debt service in particular. That reflects the city's commitment to long-term financial sustainability and funding increased capital spending that would not only address city infrastructure needs, but also stimulate the local economy. So as the Research Bureau looked at this budget proposal for another challenging year, so these are the items that I wanted to highlight during the conversation today. And as I mentioned, I very much look forward to joining some of the conversations in future budget hearings as we get into some of these issues and more in greater detail. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Pam. And I do just want to actually direct the question about new growth to Commissioner Arnello. I mean, it's a follow-up on what I had just asked, but I know that Chief Sterrett established for us the fact that the 45 is more of a, it's a reversion to the mean pre-2014. I guess I just don't know what to call apples and oranges in this case. And I guess I'm trying to think through, like, when you guys look at a number like that, naively, I would think, well, maybe we keep some kind of tally from ISD of the building permits we've issued on particularly large projects, and we have some kind of average, this is going to take 18 to 24 months to build, and then we say, well, our construction pause probably bumped everything back 3 months, so like this is how much of that we think is slipping off the rolls, or here's some things that aren't getting closed because of it. I'm just sort of curious, like, how you actually got to the 45.
Sure. So I'll take that, and then obviously Nick or more feel free to jump in. So 45 million is not a return to the mean. It's a return to the historic highs of pre-2014, right? So if you remember that chart, 45 million would have been a godsend to any budget person between 2000 and 2013, basically. So it's a sort of historic high in the big picture of Boston. And you're absolutely right. We track, Maura does a great job and Nick does a great job of tracking both the BPDA approval process, which is sort of what we go through for the major developments that you'll see in the city. The ISD building permit process is certainly something we monitor closely, which is still showing signs of strength. The problem we have is that it's impossible for us to say this project got back up and running in 3 months right away. This project actually stalled out after pausing for 3 months and isn't even back in the ground a year later. So I think some of that is going to be a little bit of a wait and see approach. The other major factor, and Nick, feel free to expand on this a little bit, personal property that was discussed earlier, certainly around business investments in major infrastructure assets, is a moving target. So think of utilities, think of phone lines, think of some of the major sort of physical assets that also make up a portion of new growth, is very determined by the business cycle. And they obviously went through their own separate economic disruption. So their ability to get back in the ground may not have even been reflected in some of the estimates. Nick, could you add anything to that? I'm sure you could.
Yeah, no, thank you, Justin. Yeah, so a lot of this is the timing for making projections for the budget does not even come close to matching up with when we get actual data. So we have some information from permits, we have some information from the BPDA about like projects in general, but the actual information request my department sends out to like determine percent complete as of the lien date of January 1st. We got those out around the end of March, beginning of April, and people have 2 months to send those back to us. And so we don't actually start to get information from actual project specific developments about how far along they were until, June, July. And then we have to start going through it. And then we're looking at valuation standards. And so it really is this like months and months long process where it might seem weird that we don't have a final number for new growth until the tax rate gets set, but that's the reality. And trust me, I want to move that up every year. Been pushing to move that up. Budget wants me to move that up.
Yeah, so do I. I want them to move it up.
Yeah, we work really hard to try and, our first goal is to get that right, but we were trying to get it right sooner in the year so that's more useful to the administration, then also more useful to the city council, and more useful for processes like this. It's really hard to predict given everything that happened last year and figuring out what the heck is going on and how exactly that impacted development. And so we want to make sure this year that we're being hopefully extremely conservative.
No, and again, I do understand that it's impossible to know it at this point. It's more just that, like, when we have to guess at a thing that we find impossible to know, we come up with rules of thumb and something, right? Like some way of throwing a dart against the wall. And obviously the dart has hit 45. And so I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah, it's more of a reflection of going back to see what is a worst case scenario in this new time period. And I think then layering on what we do think is optimism within the sort of residential market, especially, right? So like stuff has been built. There's definitely been a lot of progress made on some big projects in downtown. The question is, how much optimism do we sort of layer into that baseline level of new growth that always happens every year is where we landed on for 45. So above the sort of the worst times of the 2000s and the 2010s, but sort of still significantly below the historic sort of unprecedented highs of the last couple of years.
All right, thank you. And Pam, it's nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Thanks for a few minutes of your time. And this additional conversation around new growth was very helpful for me as well. So appreciate the moment.
Thanks. All right, I want to see if Councilor Asabi-George has any follow-up questions.
I do have a quick follow-up question. Well, at least I hope it's quick. Last year, we spent a lot of time there was a great deal of private investment in the resiliency fund. I'm wondering if there are any funds remaining in the resiliency fund, and if so, how are we looking at those dollars?
So the resiliency fund was run separate than the city budget, so there wasn't a sort of process by which we reviewed it. I will have to get you an accounting of what's left, but I believe the fund was closed out, and I believe it's been fully spent.
Okay, very good. I mean, just if it's fully spent, that's great. Thanks. That's it for me. Madam Chair, I will save the balance of my questions for the individual hearings.
Great. Thank you so much, Councilor Asabi-George. Councilor Braden?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to, I just lost my train of thought here. I think most of my colleagues have covered many of the questions that I had, so I have no further questions at this time. Thank you.
Okay, great. Before I go to Councilor Mejia, I'll just ask, because Councilor Campbell had to go, but she did send me a question. So she's just wondering about the moving through the budget pilot by Monum. Justin, what's the timeline for that? When did it start? How much are we spending on it? How many people have we engaged, or are we aiming to engage? Just if you could go into a little bit more detail on that.
Sure. So it's a partnership between Monum and a local nonprofit in East Boston around bringing the budget to folks in a different way. So basically this nonprofit will work obviously with our budget materials to craft a curriculum and then engage. It's probably several dozen residents in East Boston. I think the goal would be to pilot it, see if it is a program that sort of people respond to, and then see if we can take it sort of citywide to different neighborhoods through different mediums or through different avenues. I think we're at the forefront of trying to use, I think to Councilor Mejia's earlier point, the budget is a dense document. It's oftentimes filled with a lot of jargon. So we're trying to work through what sort of an approachable format would be. And we hope to expand it going forward. It's a relatively small investment. I think it was about 10 to 15,000 in this current fiscal year for the entire length of the program. But I'll have to follow up and get you the exact numbers.
But the 8 weeks is anticipated to be all during this process or after this process?
It's sort of running parallel to the process. It's less about sort of talking about this specific budget proposal and more about the budget itself and sort of what goes into it, and sort of more introducing the topic to folks with the numbers from FY22, but not really sort of, it's not really designed to sort of advocate for this specific budget, more to bring ideas and sort of some baseline levels of understanding of the budget to the community in a different way.
I got it. So it's more kind of budget 101 rather than, got it. Okay. Yeah, I think it sounds like Councilor Campbell would love just a little bit of follow-up detail on that would be great.
Sure.
All right, Councilor Mejia, and then Councilor Baker, if you have any follow-ups. Councilor Mejia.
I just have a few. We're seeing a lot of new funding for language access, and how will that money be used to implement the FEMA regulations recently passed down to us? And how does that current language access ordinance currently under review impact that funding? I'm also curious, when will we find out exactly how much money is coming from the ARP? Are we designing our budget in hopes that we will have exactly enough money from the ARP to fund these programs? And how can we assure people that we are not going over value with these funds? And then in regards to the CARES Act funding, we saw last year how much improvement of the housing of stability made in regards to making the application process more equitable. And I'm wondering what lessons we've learned from them, and how are we going to apply the new CARES Act funding in the future. And I just wanted to give a shout out to my policy director, Jacob Dudley-Court, who works really hard at this 1,000-page budget to prepare us for all of this, and to Councilor Bach and her office for all your hard work in making sure that people understand the complexities of these budgets. So thank you.
Sure. So I'll take them in what I think is reverse order, but let me know if I missed anything. So on the federal funding side, we've basically designed our use of federal funding to coincide with when we receive it. So we know for a fact that we're going to get at least $435 million of federal funding through the local aid portion of the American Rescue Plan, the ARP, over the next 5 years. And we know for a fact that $215 million of it is going to come in the first half of, in May, which is the first half of the money. So we know exactly the minimum amount of money we're getting. So we've designed the 22 budget to account for that. And we've split it between two things. One, using it for direct city services, which is a lot of the stuff that we've outlined today, as well as setting up this separate process to really engage the community and advocates and residents and the council about how to spend that money. So that's a separate process. So that sort of is a minimum amount of money that we've designed. On the LCA portion, we have I think it's a $300,000 investment in addition to sort of standing up as its own department this year. Obviously, it's moved out of the O&S department into the Equity and Inclusion Cabinet department. So that $300,000 is not only to expand their services in anticipation of a potential change to the ordinance, but also to support many of their ongoing efforts. There's a tremendous amount of demand for that service, and we're constantly trying to figure out the best way to use that money, whether it's through hiring new staff or new contractors or new support. So happy to defer that question to the LCA team and Chief Selena Barrios Miller on that topic as well. And then I'm blanking on the first question.
It's in regards to seeing the new funding for language access. We're just curious about how it's going to be implemented with the recently regulations that were passed down to us by FEMA, and how does the current language access ordinance currently under review impact that funding?
So I think that the current city council order, we sort of put some funding into the budget in anticipation of that passing. So I think that hopefully that'll as that order moves through the process and we sort of start to think about implementing it, we will obviously have some more funding available for them to use it. I'm not familiar with the FEMA regulation you're talking about, so I'll have to follow back up on that.
Yeah. It was a new, we got an email last week about some new regulations under FEMA. But we'll follow up with you on that.
Sure.
And I just
feel
want
free to send that my way and I'd be happy to figure that out.
And I want to just quickly ask Nick a follow-up question about the personal property tax. Councilor Bach, I'm just curious about how that communication was shared. I've gotten a lot of calls and emails from Spanish-speaking businesses, and I'm just curious whether or not those notices were translated in multiple languages.
Thank you for the question, Councilor Mejia. To be honest, I'll have to check and see how our notice went out with our formal list requests. I'm just not quite sure off the top of my head the answer to that, but I'm happy to look into it and get back to you.
Yeah, and then I also know that there was a deadline attached to that. And so I'm just curious, for those folks who did not compile, you guys did an assessment. And I'm curious if there was any follow-up to those businesses in terms of, this is what we're assessing you for, and if there is any opportunity for them to revise that so that it can be more accurately reflected in the reality of it.
Sure. So personal property taxes get assessed on the same timeline as real estate taxes. There's a slightly different timeline in terms of reporting, and it has to do with a discovery issue, right? So real estate, we know what exists. It's easy to identify real estate. We can go and we can see there's a building here, there's a piece of land here. Personal property, there's this self-reporting requirement. And so that is it's called a form of list. That's what's due by March 1st every year is the filing date for that. That then identifies what property we will issue a tax on for the subsequent fiscal year. So this year's March 1st deadline was to identify property that will get assessed in fiscal year 22. And then personal property gets the same quarterly billing as real estate taxes. And so the first 2 quarters that are estimates. The third quarter is the bill issued after the tax rate is finalized. And so that's the one that people's abatement rates come off of. And so businesses and individuals have the same opportunity to file for an abatement on their personal property tax during the month of January. And so it has the same kind of rules around abatements and appeals that real estate does. And the notices, I know for certain that the notices with the bills that went out in the third quarter all had specific language access inserts in them. So that I can definitely speak to. I'm not sure about the formal bliss part because it's a slightly different process, but I can definitely look into that.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Ball.
Thank you so much, Councilor Mejia. And your shout out to Jacob reminded me to acknowledge Emily Brown, my budget director, who's doing great work on my behalf on this front, and also our central staff budget team, Michelle and Cora and Shane, and of course, Carrie and Candace, who do so much work behind the scenes. We'll be thanking them frequently, but I wanted to add that shout out. Councilor Baker, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Justin, you may have said this already, but the Suffolk County money that comes in, that will be a percentage, and it just comes in. We don't need to do anything as the city, and that will go through the regular processes of all the other money that's coming in on the Fed side.
It'll go through the same city council process. So whatever the dollar amount is, we'll go through and accept and expend. The difference is we actually have to go. The reason why we don't have the exact number yet on that is that money is actually going to go through the state and then comes to us. Now, I don't anticipate any sort of major disruptions with that, but we still don't have that exact number. It'll depend a little bit on what the guidance that comes from the feds is on the population that they choose. So whether it's the most recent census or if it's one of the intermittent community, I forget what they're called, but there's an intermittent census that they do that is also could potentially be used. So we're just not exactly sure which one's going to get utilized.
And is the time frame relatively the same on that? A piece in May, and then the rest of it will be out over four more years. So over 5 years, we'll get that 120 million.
Yeah, so the state will get the state will get the money in May, the same time we get our money. It may be some lag time between when the state gets it and gives it to us, just because I'm sure we'll have to do contracts or do some sort of mechanism with them. So that money, that's sort of the rationale is that's why we're not sort of talking about that yet, is because we have a long way to go and we want to have obviously a thoughtful conversation with the council and the public about it.
So the state gets it, then they have to figure out how to give it to us. And will it come in as 120 million once the state conveys it over to us?
It'll be half. So we'll get half in May and then we'll get half the following May, I assume. I think that's probably what the federal guidance will say, because there are obviously other counties within Massachusetts that are dealing with this, but there's other counties that are dealing with this in the country who don't have county governments the way we do. So I think that hopefully the guidance that comes out in May will lay out exactly how the state is supposed to process it. It is really not supposed to be a cumbersome process. It's supposed to be just a pass through for the most part.
Yeah. Okay. In the 40 million in new investments, is that 40 million with Fed money?
Yes.
So we can expect though, so we can't implement any of that until the money comes in May. So that's probably the money that I think needs to be broken down and come through the city council as, 2 million going through here, 3 million going there. That's what I think should happen with that money. It shouldn't be, you guys get 40 million, then it goes whatever way the departments are thinking. I think that we as a city council, I'm glad we're bringing the community in on this and dance parties and everything else. But the city council is the group that's set up to oversee the finances.
Absolutely, and the It's a good distinction. It's a good point. So the federal money that we're using in the city budget is going through the same regulatory and oversight process that you go through for all the rest of the money, right? So D&D is going to get $2.5 million of federal money, say. You're going to have the same oversight of that money in the current budget process that you do with the other general fund money we have. So that is, the council will have direct oversight and direct approval of that funding immediately. The separate pot of money that we're setting aside is more for less government services, which is sort of not stuff that we typically do, and more grants and more public facing investments, as opposed to the government services side of things, which is why we split them up, which will also have a separate process by which we do an accept and expend. So I think there is ample opportunity, and I will certainly work out the details, but oversight is going to be, I think, key, and is going to be happening in a couple different fashions, both through the operating budget, that the normal process that we're kicking off today, and then again, an additional process through the accept and expend orders that we'll be filing.
Yeah, so those will be broken up. Those accept and expend orders will be broken up into smaller increments, so we know where the money's going.
So there'll be, we haven't gotten guidance yet, so we don't know exactly how we're going to have to do it. But the theory is that the portion of money we're talking about for FY20, this $50 million, will basically, it comes in as general fund revenue. So it'll be sort of part of the sauce that goes in, and we'll identify sort of what those projects are that we're spending it on. We don't spend, your property taxes on, this service, right? We don't break that specifically down. So there won't be that level of connection on that funding. We could certainly look forward to partnering with you on the accept and expend for the other money about what that might look like in terms of specific allocations for grants.
So again, the accept and expend is not going to be $215 million, except which trust me, I want to accept it and I want to expend it some way, but I want to make sure that we as a city council have a say in on this, and it's not just the administration spending money the way the administration sees. There's needs all across the city here. So I just want to make sure that we play a big part in that money that comes through, whether if it's Fed money, whether if we're taking the Fed money and spending our operational money, and then we put the Fed money on top of that. It still, I think, needs to be broken up and said, okay, this accept and expend is going to be part of the Fed money, and this is where we would like to see it go. And I don't know if I'm not making sense, but
no, you are. I think we're waiting on the federal guidance, so I can't commit to anything like what's like drafting form, because we're going to be working on that. What I can say is the council will have direct oversight of the initial federal money through both the accept and expend process and through the annual budget process. They are very much linked this year. So a vote on one is going to be a vote on the other. I think the separate conversation, and obviously we will work with the council on the best way to display this, is how do we describe that other bucket of money that's not going through the city side is going to be a conversation, and we're going to have to work through what that looks like.
Yeah, because that statement there sounds to me like accept and expend is a big accept and expend, and then dance party, we got $200 million to spend whatever way we want, So I really want to see that broken up, separated. So this is the money that we have, that we knew we were going to have. This is Fed money. I want to be able to make sure that money's coming in, not over and above this budget process that we're handling now, because this is new money here. New money here that we should, as the fiscal stewards, the city council, the fiscal stewards, we should have a say in where it goes. It shouldn't just be the administration in this one here.
Councilor Baker, if I may, I would just like to say again that I've been very clear about that on behalf of the Ways and Means Committee, and we will not be signing a blank check for the administration to make a decision about this money. I think there is and so I just want to agree with you and say I think we will be engaging in that, and ultimately it's up to us not to vote for an accept and expend until we feel comfortable with that degree of accountability.
Yeah, because I'm not convinced it's gonna happen the way I would like to see it happen, or even the way you would like to see it happen. So
Right,
If-
but I would say that it's up to us ultimately. I mean, we're not gonna, I think what I've tried to say a few times gently is that the suggestion that we're just gonna vote the 115 through and then a coordinated committee of city departments is gonna decide what happens after our vote is not, I think, a plausible.
Well,
route.
there's a committee that's already been, that looks like it's being set up to figure out where the money's gonna go, and we're not gonna be part of that committee.
Right, but the point is that all of that has to be justified to us before we're gonna vote on anything.
Yeah, and that's the point I'm trying to make. I'm trying to hammer home a point here that's important to me. If it's important to you, that's great. Then there's two of us hammering home the same point, but I'm hammering home a point here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you,
And-
Madam Chair.
And I'll just say, and I do think there's a distinction between what the administration's proposing is that 50 million of the 215 is backfilling lost revenue in this budget, right? So I think what Justin's saying with that is that money, they're not gonna say, it's $1 million here and $1 million there, because the point is it's enabling the net new stuff.
But there's 40 million in new investments. It's gonna be all Fed money. Correct?
Yep, and that's gonna come through the regular city. So you're when you vote on the budget, whenever you're voting on that federal money and that allocation. If you don't agree with it, that's certainly your prerogative, but it's also your time where you can make your point known through that process. The distinction with this federal money this year is that it's different than any other type of federal money we've received in the past, in that a portion of it can be used for sort of baseline city services, which we're proposing in the FY22 operating budget. And then there's a separate pot of money, which is also eligible, which is more towards outward facing grants and the like, and I think we don't need to belabor the point anymore, but I think we will work with the council to create a process by which everyone feels comfortable.
Well, that's what I want to make sure. That 40 million, that's outward facing grants that we should play an integral part in. That should come through city council, the COVID committee that we set up, is what I think. Okay, thank you. I did have something else, but I don't know what it is. Thank you.
Okay, well, send it over to us and we'll send it along to them if you think of it later. Okay, I think I've run through all my colleagues twice. I'm gonna assume, unless someone raises their hand, that folks are all right for now. Obviously, like I said, we're at the beginning of a process here. I do want to acknowledge that I think there are some commitments in this budget that reflect kind of making more permanent some of the increases that counselors fought for last year. I know that personally, I was very concerned that our youth jobs and food access and Age Strong, et cetera, commitments from last year not be kind of one-off things. So I was excited to see that. And I'm definitely looking forward to talking more about the funding that's been suggested for green jobs and filling commercial vacancies. I think there's some exciting stuff to talk about ahead, but certainly just want to underscore Councillor Baker's point that the council looks and has frankly the responsibility to be a robust partner in these appropriation decisions, and so that's what we're going to be doing in the year ahead. Let me see. All right, I don't see any blue hands. Chief Sterrett, did you have anything you wanted to say in conclusion before I gavel us out?
No, just thank you, and look forward to a very productive process. And thank you for your leadership, Councillor, on building out this process and certainly making it robust, and many more conversations to come, and look forward to getting a budget passed. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And with that, this hearing is now adjourned. See you all soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye all.